Winston Churchill, one of the most influential leaders of the 20th century, was born on November 30th, 1874, in Blenheim Palace, Oxfordshire, England. His birth was not just the arrival of a future prime minister. It marked the beginning of a life that would be shaped by both privilege and struggle. Churchill was born into the aristocratic Spencer Churchill family, whose legacy was woven into the fabric of British nobility. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a prominent conservative politician, a man of great ambition, known for his sharp wit and fiery speeches. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American socialite from Brooklyn, New York, whose beauty and charm captivated London's elite. Together, they made for a powerful union, representing the crossing of two worlds, the old world aristocracy and the new world wealth and influence. Despite this powerful lineage, Churchill's childhood was marked by emotional struggles. His parents, though loving in their own way, were distant figures. His father, often absorbed in his political career, had little time for young Winston. Lord Randolph, though a highly intelligent and ambitious man, was known for his cold demeanor towards his son. This emotional distance would leave a deep mark on Churchill, shaping his sense of independence and determination. Churchill's relationship with his mother, on the other hand, was a bit different. Jenny, although distant from him as a child, had a profound influence on Churchill's later years. She was a woman of remarkable intelligence and charm, a member of London's high society, and a supporter of her son's political ambitions, often acting as a bridge between him and the power players of British society. This early environment of privilege, combined with emotional alienation, set the tone for Churchill's relentless drive for attention and approval. As a child, he was rarely praised, which led him to crave recognition on a much larger scale. He often felt overshadowed by his father's larger-than-life figure, but also motivated by the need to prove himself to a family who seemed to regard him as an afterthought. Even as a child, Churchill was destined to leave a mark on history. But it was clear early on that his path would not be an easy one. The struggles with his father's expectations, combined with the emotional challenges of his early years, would push him toward an unyielding pursuit of greatness. Winston Churchill's early years were marked by a sense of both privilege and frustration. As the son of Lord Randolph Churchill and Jenny Jerome, it was expected that Winston would follow in his father's political footsteps. However, as we'll see, Churchill's journey to success was not an easy one, and much of this difficulty began in the classrooms he attended. Churchill's formal education began at the prestigious Harrow School, one of the oldest and most respected boarding schools in Britain. Harrow was a place where the sons of the British aristocracy were sent to be groomed for positions of influence. But for young Winston, it was not the start of a smooth academic career. Churchill, despite his brilliance in certain areas, struggled with academic discipline and focus. His early years at Harrow were far from exemplary. He was often at odds with the rigid school structure, and his grades reflected this rebellion. He found himself at the bottom of his class in subjects like Latin and Greek, despite his natural intellect. His teachers were often critical of him, and he was reprimanded for his lack of seriousness. But it wasn't all failure. Churchill had a remarkable ability to read and analyze political history, and his ability to engage in debates and discussions was noticed by a few of his more perceptive mentors. These early signs of his political acumen would become essential in shaping his future career. The real turning point in his educational journey came when Churchill was sent to Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, an institution known for producing officers for the British Army. At Sandhurst, the expectations were high, and failure was not an option for the sons of prominent families. Unlike Harrow, where Churchill had struggled academically, Sandhurst gave him an opportunity to prove himself in a practical environment. Here, Churchill excelled. His natural leadership ability began to shine through. He may not have been the top student in every subject, but he quickly made a name for himself as a determined and ambitious cadet. His dedication to military strategy and his quick decision-making skills helped him stand out among his peers. For the first time in his life, Churchill felt he was in the right place, an environment where his rebellious spirit could translate into leadership and action. In 1894, Churchill graduated from Sandhurst and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the British Army. This was a moment of great personal achievement for him, one that validated all the struggles and frustrations of his early years. But it was not the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. Churchill's time at Harrow and Sandhurst taught him several important lessons: perseverance, the importance of self-reliance, and, most crucially, that true success often comes from overcoming obstacles. These lessons would guide him throughout his political and military career, but they were hard-won, forged in the crucible of childhood adversity and academic struggle. After graduating from the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in 1894, Winston Churchill embarked on a journey that would be critical in shaping his character and future. Unlike many of his peers, Churchill's military service was not confined to the safe confines of the British Empire. Instead, he chose the path of adventure, placing himself at the heart of some of the most dangerous conflicts of the time. It was during this period that Churchill's rebellious spirit and thirst for action would be put to the test. That Churchill's first military posting was as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, a cavalry regiment. But it wasn't the traditional route for a young officer. Churchill quickly sought opportunities that would take him beyond mere training exercises. His ambition was not to sit idle in the barracks, but to experience the world and gain recognition on the battlefield. His opportunity came in 1895 when he was appointed as a war correspondent for the Morning Post, a leading British newspaper. This role allowed Churchill to combine his military training with his burgeoning interest in writing and politics. His first assignment took him to Cuba, where he observed the Spanish-American War. This was his first real taste of combat, though he did not participate directly. Instead, he gathered stories from the front lines, writing dispatches that captured the intensity. In 1899, Churchill's adventure took a more significant turn when he was sent to South Africa to cover the Second Boer War. This conflict, fought between the British Empire and the Boer republics, was one of the defining wars of the late 19th century. Churchill's experiences during this war would cement his reputation and shape his future. While in South Africa, Churchill once again combined his role as a journalist with his military duties. He was captured by the Boers during a reconnaissance mission, an event that would become one of the defining moments of his early military career. As a prisoner of war, Churchill displayed his characteristic resilience. After several months of captivity, he made a daring escape from the Boer prison camp in Pretoria. His escape was not just a matter of survival. It was an audacious act that would become part of his legend. He crossed the country, evading the enemy, and eventually reached safety in Portuguese East Africa, where he was able to return to British-controlled territory. The escape turned Churchill into a national hero in Britain, though his military career was still young. More importantly, it showcased the qualities that would define him throughout his life: boldness, determination, and an unyielding will to overcome obstacles. Upon returning to Britain, Churchill's experiences in South Africa earned him a hero's welcome. But it also gave him valuable insight into the nature of war, politics, and leadership. These experiences would form the foundation of his later political career, providing him with a unique perspective on leadership during times of conflict. In addition to his military service, these early years shaped Churchill's understanding of the role of the press and public perception. His reporting from the front lines helped him build connections with influential figures in British society and media, relationships that would later prove beneficial in his political career. Churchill's military service, far from being just a stepping stone, was a key part of his personal and professional development. It taught him leadership under pressure, the importance of resilience in the face of adversity, and the art of managing public perception, lessons he would carry with him as he entered the political arena. By the turn of the 20th century, Winston Churchill was already gaining attention, not just for his military exploits, but also for his rising ambitions in the world of politics. While his early life had been marked by academic struggles and rebelliousness, his time in the military had given him a taste of leadership and public recognition. It was now time for him to take the next step, to forge a career that would change the course of British and world history. Churchill's entry into politics came in 1900 when, at the age of 25, he successfully ran for a seat in the House of Commons. He stood as the Conservative candidate for the Oldham constituency, a traditionally working-class area in Lancashire. However, his route to Parliament was unconventional. He had only recently left the military and had no extensive political experience. Yet his charismatic personality and his remarkable ability to engage with people helped him secure victory. Churchill's rise to politics was as dramatic as his earlier life, and his name was becoming synonymous with ambition and drive. But Churchill's political career didn't follow the typical trajectory for someone of his background. Though he began his political career as a conservative, he quickly grew disillusioned with the party's conservative stances. He found himself at odds with the traditional political elite, who prioritized preserving the status quo. Churchill was more interested in pushing for reform, modernization, and change. In 1904, Churchill made the bold decision to switch political allegiances. He left the Conservative Party and joined the Liberal Party, a move that shocked many of his contemporaries. At the time, the Liberal Party was seen as more progressive, with an emphasis on social reforms and addressing the needs of the working class. Churchill, eager to make an impact, felt that the Liberal Party's vision for the future aligned more closely with his own values. This dramatic shift was not without controversy. Churchill's decision to leave the Conservatives, especially after having just won a seat on their behalf, was seen by many as a betrayal. His personal and political integrity was questioned, and his move was met with a great deal of criticism from his former allies. Yet, Churchill was undeterred. He believed deeply in his own convictions and was determined to make a real difference in the political landscape. By 1905, Churchill had become a rising star in the Liberal Party, earning respect for his speeches and ideas, even though he was still a relatively young figure. He quickly gained the attention of the party's leadership, and within just a few years, he was appointed to important roles in government. His early political career saw him advocate for a range of social reforms, including efforts to improve the conditions of workers, support for social welfare, and better housing. His passion for public service and his bold ideas made him a prominent figure in the liberal ranks. However, Churchill's early political career was not without its setbacks. In 1906, he was appointed to a position in the Board of Trade, a department responsible for overseeing industrial regulation. While this position allowed him to push for reforms, it also put him in the firing line of political opponents. As a young, ambitious politician, he was often met with resistance, and his ideas were not always well received. Despite the challenges, Churchill's determination to create lasting change was unwavering. By 1905, Churchill's political identity was beginning to take shape. He was a man of bold ideas, a reformer, and a challenger of the status quo. His ability to navigate the complexities of British politics and his willingness to challenge his own party set him apart from many of his peers. The coming years would prove to be critical in shaping his political legacy, and his determination would eventually lead him to the highest office in the land. By the mid-1900s, Winston Churchill's political career was on an upward trajectory. Having switched from the Conservative Party to the Liberal Party in 1904, Churchill found himself in the midst of a rapidly changing political landscape. While the move was initially met with skepticism and criticism, it became clear that Churchill's vision for Britain aligned more closely with the progressive ideas of the Liberals. His passion for social reforms and his growing influence in the party made him a figure to watch. In 1906, Churchill was appointed to a significant role within the Board of Trade, a government department tasked with overseeing the regulation of industries and trade. The position marked a critical turning point in his career. It was here that Churchill began to show his true political prowess, advocating for the welfare of workers, housing reforms, and the regulation of industries that were often exploitative toward the poor. He was a tireless advocate for social justice, believing that Britain's prosperity should be built on the welfare of its people, not just its elite. But it was not just his policy proposals that helped Churchill rise to prominence. His sharp intellect, fiery speeches, and remarkable ability to connect with the public also set him apart. Churchill's speeches became famous for their eloquence, passion, and conviction. He was a master at stirring the hearts of his listeners, making them believe that change was not only possible but necessary. His ability to speak to the people made him a popular figure, even outside the political elite. It was this oratory skill, combined with his deep sense of purpose, that laid the foundation for his future success. Yet, despite his growing influence, Churchill was not without his critics. His willingness to challenge the status quo and speak his mind often made him a divisive figure. His decision to support the people's budget in 1909, a proposal that aimed to increase social welfare, spending, and tax the wealthy, was particularly controversial. The proposal faced strong opposition from both the Conservative Party and wealthy landowners, who saw it as a threat to their power and privilege. The debate over the people's budget became a defining moment in Churchill's political career. Despite the fierce opposition, Churchill stood firm, determined to see the reforms passed. His tenacity and determination to challenge the old guard earned him both admiration and resentment. It was also during this period that Churchill learned some of the most important lessons of his political career. He realized that achieving meaningful change often required pushing through immense opposition and enduring personal attacks. Churchill's ability to stand his ground, even in the face of powerful adversaries, would become one of his defining characteristics. He learned that political success was not just about being right. It was about having the strength and resolve to carry on, even when the odds were stacked against him. Churchill's rise to prominence was also marked by his growing influence within the Liberal Party. In 1910, he was appointed to the position of First Lord of the Admiralty, overseeing the Royal Navy, a role that would catapult him into the heart of British politics. It was here that Churchill's political career would take on a more national, even global, significance. But before he could reach these heights, he had to navigate through some of the most intense political battles of his early career. His time in the Board of Trade and later as First Lord of the Admiralty demonstrated Churchill's dual nature, a visionary reformer who sought to improve the lives of the common people, but also a man who was willing to confront powerful forces in order to achieve his goals. These years laid the groundwork for the politician that Churchill would become, one who would not back down from a challenge, no matter how great. The lessons Churchill learned during this time were invaluable. He discovered that leadership was about more than just policy. It was about inspiring people, challenging the establishment, and never compromising on core beliefs. These lessons would serve him well as he navigated the turbulent years ahead, leading Britain through the devastating crises of the First World War and beyond. As Winston Churchill's career continued to rise, his political strategies became more refined and focused on long-term influence. By 1910, Churchill had firmly established himself as one of the key figures in the Liberal Party. His previous roles, particularly as the First Lord of the Admiralty, had brought him closer to the heart of the British government, positioning him for even greater challenges ahead. However, it was his approach to both policy and politics that began to set him apart from other leaders of the time. Churchill's time at the Admiralty was a particularly formative period. As the head of the Royal Navy, he not only oversaw the development of naval strategies, but also became a vocal advocate for modernization within the military. He was instrumental in the creation of the Royal Flying Corps and pushed for the development of new technologies and military techniques. Churchill's belief in the importance of technological innovation and modernization would prove vital during his leadership in the Second World War, but it was his early commitment to this cause that laid the groundwork. In 1906, Churchill was appointed to a significant role within the Board of Trade, a government department tasked with overseeing the regulation of industries and trade. The position marked a critical turning point in his career. It was here that Churchill began to show his true political prowess, advocating for the welfare of workers, housing reforms, and the regulation of industries that were often exploitative toward the poor. He was a tireless advocate for social justice, believing that Britain's prosperity should be built on the welfare of its people, not just its elite. But it was not just his policy proposals that helped Churchill rise to prominence. His sharp intellect, fiery speeches, and remarkable ability to connect with the public also set him apart. Churchill's speeches became famous for their eloquence, passion, and conviction. He was a master at stirring the hearts of his listeners, making them believe that change was not only possible but necessary. His ability to speak to the people made him a popular figure, even outside the political elite. It was this oratory skill, combined with his deep sense of purpose, that laid the foundation for his future success. Yet, despite his growing influence, Churchill was not without his critics. His willingness to challenge the status quo and speak his mind often made him a divisive figure. His decision to support the people's budget in 1909, a proposal that aimed to increase social welfare, spending, and tax the wealthy, was particularly controversial. The proposal faced strong opposition from both the Conservative Party and wealthy landowners, who saw it as a threat to their power and privilege. The debate over the people's budget became a defining moment in Churchill's political career. Despite the fierce opposition, Churchill stood firm, determined to see the reforms passed. His tenacity and determination to challenge the old guard earned him both admiration and resentment. It was also during this period that Churchill learned some of the most important lessons of his political career. He realized that achieving meaningful change often required pushing through immense opposition and enduring personal attacks. Churchill's ability to stand his ground, even in the face of powerful adversaries, would become one of his defining characteristics. He learned that political success was not just about being right. It was about having the strength and resolve to carry on, even when the odds were stacked against him. Churchill's rise to prominence was also marked by his growing influence within the Liberal Party. In 1910, he was appointed to the position of First Lord of the Admiralty, overseeing the Royal Navy, a role that would catapult him into the heart of British politics. It was here that Churchill's political career would take on a more national, even global, significance. But before he could reach these heights, he had to navigate through some of the most intense political battles of his early career. His time in the Board of Trade and later as First Lord of the Admiralty demonstrated Churchill's dual nature: a visionary reformer who sought to improve the lives of the common people, but also a man who was willing to confront powerful forces in order to achieve his goals. These years laid the groundwork for the politician that Churchill would become, one who would not back down from a challenge, no matter how great. The lessons Churchill learned during this time were invaluable. He discovered that leadership was about more than just policy. It was about inspiring people, challenging the establishment, and never compromising on core beliefs. These lessons would serve him well as he navigated the turbulent years ahead, leading Britain through the devastating crises of the First World War and beyond. As Winston Churchill's career continued to rise, his political strategies became more refined and focused on long-term influence. By 1910, Churchill had firmly established himself as one of the key figures in the Liberal Party. His previous roles, particularly as the First Lord of the Admiralty, had brought him closer to the heart of the British government, positioning him for even greater challenges ahead. However, it was his approach to both policy and politics that began to set him apart from other leaders of the time. Churchill's time at the Admiralty was a particularly formative period. As the head of the Royal Navy, he not only oversaw the development of naval strategies, but also became a vocal advocate for modernization within military. He was instrumental in the creation of the Royal Flying Corps and pushed for the development of new technologies and military techniques. Churchill's belief in the importance of technological innovation and modernization would prove vital during his leadership in the Second World War, but it was his early commitment to this cause that laid the groundwork. At the same time, Churchill's role in the political landscape was evolving. By the time the 1910 general election arrived, Britain was facing increasing social unrest. The Labour Party was growing in influence, and there was rising support for policies that would benefit the working class. Churchill, having already demonstrated a commitment to progressive reform, found himself at the center of these debates. He became a staunch advocate for the people's budget and social reforms, but his approach to these issues was not purely about social justice. It was also about maintaining political power for the Liberal Party, which was facing mounting opposition from the Conservative Party. Churchill's political strategy was increasingly about positioning himself as the champion of the working class, while maintaining the loyalty of the aristocracy and business elites. This dual approach earned him both admirers and critics. While many working-class citizens appreciated his advocacy for social reforms, some of the old guard within the Liberal Party saw him as too radical, even unpredictable. But Churchill's political intuition allowed him to maneuver through these tensions, often playing one side off against the other to achieve his goals. One of the key moments during this period was the House of Lords crisis in 1911, when Churchill played a pivotal role in pushing through legislation that would limit the power of the House of Lords, the unelected upper chamber of Parliament. The House of Lords had used its power to block the people's budget, a move that threatened to undo years of reform. Churchill was a leading advocate for the Parliament Act of 1911, which reduced the Lords' power to veto bills passed by the House of Commons. This was a critical step toward democratizing Britain's political system and weakening the influence of the aristocracy. Despite his achievements, Churchill's strategies were not without controversy. His progressive ideas, combined with his willingness to confront both his own party and the opposition, made him a divisive figure. He was often seen as a radical by the Conservatives and a political opportunist by some members of the Liberal Party. Yet Churchill's resilience and ability to pivot when necessary allowed him to emerge from these political storms unscathed. As tensions in Europe began to mount in the years leading up to the First World War, Churchill's role in the Admiralty would become even more crucial. He was already formulating plans for Britain's involvement in a potential conflict, advocating for a stronger, more modernized fleet that could safeguard Britain's interests. His foresight in military strategy, coupled with his political savvy, set the stage for the critical decisions he would make during the war. But long before the outbreak of the First World War, Churchill was already laying the groundwork for his future role as one of the most influential figures in British history. In this period, Churchill also developed a crucial understanding of the importance of public perception. He had learned from his earlier experiences that winning the public's trust and support was just as important as political maneuvering behind closed doors. Churchill became a master at using his speeches to rally the nation, building a strong personal brand that resonated with the British public. He understood that leadership was about more than just policies. It was about connecting with people and inspiring them to believe in a better future. Churchill's growing influence during these years was not just the result of his policies, but also his ability to navigate the political tides of the time. He had become a leader who could unite different factions, challenge old ideas, and maintain his position at the center of British political life. His strategies, built on boldness, adaptability, and a deep understanding of public sentiment, would serve him well as he entered the most critical period of his life, the First World War. As Europe stood on the brink of World War I, Winston Churchill found himself in the heart of British political life. By 1914, his previous years in government had transformed him into one of Britain's most dynamic and controversial figures. His time at the Admiralty, combined with his passion for reform, had positioned him as a rising leader within the Liberal Party. But as the specter of war loomed over Europe, Churchill's true test as a leader was about to begin. In 1914, the outbreak of the First World War brought Churchill into the forefront of Britain's wartime leadership. As the First Lord of the Admiralty, he was tasked with overseeing the British Royal Navy, a critical component in protecting Britain's empire and its interests. His position was one of immense responsibility, especially considering that Britain's naval forces would be a key player in the war. Despite facing initial skepticism from his peers, Churchill's vision for a modern, more mobile navy was pivotal in shaping Britain's naval strategy during the early stages of the war. However, Churchill's tenure at the Admiralty was not without controversy. One of the most defining events of his time in office was the Gallipoli Campaign of 1915. The campaign, which aimed to open up a new front against the Ottoman Empire by seizing control of the Dardanelles, was a disastrous failure. The operation, poorly planned and executed, resulted in heavy casualties and a humiliating defeat for the British forces. The Gallipoli disaster marked a turning point in Churchill's career, and it was a blow from which he would not recover immediately. The failure of Gallipoli sparked a wave of criticism, both within the military and the political establishment. Churchill, who had championed the campaign as a bold and necessary step, was blamed for its disastrous outcome. The public outcry was fierce, and many in the government and the military began to question Churchill's judgment. As a result, he was forced to resign from his position as First Lord of the Admiralty in 1915, marking a temporary fall from grace. But Churchill's resilience, as always, came to the forefront. Rather than retreat from public life, he made the bold decision to leave government service and return to the front lines of war. He took up a commission as a lieutenant colonel with the Royal Scots Fusiliers, serving in the trenches of Belgium. Although his military experience during this period was far less glamorous than his time in the Admiralty, it provided him with invaluable insight into the horrors of modern warfare. Churchill's time in the trenches, however, was short-lived. The brutal realities of war, combined with the changing tides of British politics, soon brought him back into the political fold. In 1917, as the war continued to ravage Europe, Churchill was appointed to a new role as Minister of Munitions. This position allowed him to leverage his leadership and organizational skills to oversee the production and supply of war materials, a critical task that would directly impact the war's outcome. His work in this capacity earned him praise for his efficiency and his ability to make crucial decisions under pressure. By the end of the First World War in 1918, Churchill had proven himself not only as a political leader, but also as a man who could endure and learn from failure. The Gallipoli disaster, while a setback, had become an essential part of his political journey. It had taught him valuable lessons about the complexities of leadership, the importance of careful planning, and the necessity of learning from mistakes. In the years following the war, Churchill's reputation would slowly recover, and he would go on to play a key role in British politics once again. He became increasingly known for his ability to face adversity head-on, using his experiences in war to shape his vision for Britain's future. His time as Minister of Munitions had given him first-hand experience with the challenges of modern warfare, a perspective that would prove invaluable during his leadership in the Second World War. Churchill's path to leadership was defined by triumphs and setbacks, by moments of glory and moments of failure. But it was his determination to keep moving forward, to adapt and grow from each experience, that made him one of history's most enduring and revered leaders. As the world entered a new phase of conflict in the 1930s, Churchill would be ready, armed with the lessons of his past and the indomitable will to lead Britain through the coming storm. As we reach the end of Churchill's formative years, it's clear that the man who would become one of history's most iconic leaders was already beginning to take shape. Winston Churchill's early life was marked by a series of personal and professional challenges that tested both his character and his resolve. These formative years, from his tumultuous childhood to his early career in politics and the military, were not only a training ground for his future leadership, but also a series of lessons that would shape his unique approach to politics and public life. One of the most important lessons Churchill learned during these years was the value of resilience. From an early age, Churchill faced obstacles that many would find insurmountable. He struggled academically at Harrow and Sandhurst, feeling the weight of his family's high expectations while contending with personal insecurities. Despite these struggles, Churchill never gave up. His determination to prove himself was unshakable. It was this resilience that would become one of his defining qualities as a leader, enabling him to weather not only the political storms of his time, but also the personal setbacks that came his way. Churchill's early military service further reinforced this lesson in resilience. After his capture during the Boer War and subsequent daring escape, he learned that success was not just about winning battles or achieving goals. It was about the willingness to face failure and keep moving forward. His escape from the Boer POW camp was more than just an act of heroism. It was a declaration of his ability to overcome the most dire of circumstances. The public's response to his escape catapulted him to national fame, but it was the internal, personal conviction that mattered most. Churchill had learned that every setback was simply an opportunity to come back stronger. Another key lesson that shaped Churchill's early career was the importance of public perception and communication. Even in his earliest years in the House of Commons, Churchill understood the power of words and how they could shape both political careers and public opinion. His oratory skills were developing, and he quickly became known for his ability to speak with passion, clarity, and conviction. He knew that to be successful in politics, it wasn't enough to have the right policies. It was crucial to inspire and connect with people on a deep, emotional level. At the same time, Churchill's shifting political allegiances demonstrated an important lesson in adaptability. His decision to leave the Conservative Party and join the Liberals in 1904 shocked many, but it reflected a key trait that would define his career: an unwavering commitment to doing what he believed was right, even when it meant alienating former allies. Churchill's defection wasn't merely a political move. It was a statement about his values and his vision for the future of Britain. It was a lesson that would serve him well when he would later take bold, sometimes controversial positions as a leader in the years to come. Moreover, Churchill's early experiences taught him the importance of broadening his horizons and seeking knowledge beyond the confines of politics. His time as a war correspondent, traveling to far-flung places like Cuba and South Africa, gave him first-hand experience of the world in a way that most politicians of his time never had. These experiences not only broadened his understanding of global politics, but also gave him a deep appreciation for the realities of war and the personal sacrifices that accompanied it. Ultimately, Churchill's early life and career were marked by a series of contradictions. A man who was both loved and hated, both a brilliant strategist and an occasional failure, both deeply ambitious and often misunderstood. But these contradictions didn't hold him back. They defined his character and fueled his determination to become a leader of global stature. His early life, filled with challenges and setbacks, proved to be the perfect preparation for the monumental struggles he would face in the years ahead. The lessons of resilience, adaptability, communication, and the ability to learn from both success and failure became the bedrock of Churchill's leadership style. These qualities would not only help him survive the political and military challenges that lay ahead, but would also help him inspire a nation to stand strong during the most difficult times in history. As we move forward in his story, it's clear that the foundation laid during these early years would propel Churchill to greatness on the world stage. Winston Churchill's political career took a dramatic turn in 1904, when, after much internal reflection and growing dissatisfaction with the Conservative Party's policies, he made the bold decision to switch sides and join the Liberal Party. This move shocked both his allies and adversaries, as Churchill had been a staunch conservative for much of his early political life. But his commitment to reform and social justice had grown stronger, and he found the Conservative Party's conservative policies increasingly at odds with his vision for Britain's future. Churchill's decision to cross the aisle was not merely a political maneuver, it was a commitment to change. His belief in free trade, social welfare, and progressivism led him to the Liberal Party, a group more willing to embrace reform. In 1906, he won a seat in Parliament under the Liberal banner, representing Dundee, a working-class constituency. His personal and professional evolution was beginning to align with the values of the Liberal Party, as he quickly became a forceful advocate for social reform. As a member of the Liberal Party, Churchill's passion for progressive policy became more pronounced, and he found himself involved in a number of high-profile debates concerning trade, labor rights, and the expansion of social services. By 1908, Churchill's political rise had led to an appointment in the government as the president of the Board of Trade, a key position that dealt with issues like industrial regulation and labor laws. In this role, Churchill pushed through significant reforms, including the establishment of labor exchanges to assist unemployed workers and the extension of working hours legislation to protect factory workers. His efforts were part of a broader movement toward social democracy, which sought to address the needs of the working class while maintaining the stability of the British Empire. However, it was Churchill's appointment as First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911 that truly elevated him to national prominence. The Admiralty was the center of Britain's naval power, and the role of First Lord was one of the most powerful positions in the British government. At the time, Britain was facing increasing competition from Germany, whose naval buildup threatened to undermine Britain's control of the seas. Churchill's appointment was viewed with a mix of admiration and skepticism. He was young, ambitious, and unafraid of ruffling feathers. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill immediately set to work modernizing the Royal Navy. He advocated for the development of new ships, the construction of faster, more efficient vessels, and the integration of advanced technologies like submarines and aircraft into Britain's naval strategies. Churchill understood that the future of warfare would be defined by technological innovation, and he was determined to ensure that Britain would maintain its position as the world's preeminent naval power. He also played a key role in improving the coordination between the Navy and other branches of the military, emphasizing the importance of inter-service cooperation in times of conflict. Despite the challenges he faced, Churchill's tenure at the Admiralty was marked by a sense of urgency and forward-thinking leadership. His early tenure was a mix of bold ideas and controversial decisions, yet laid the groundwork for many of the strategies that would be instrumental in the First World War. Churchill had begun to emerge as a central figure in British politics, a man who was not only ready to embrace the future, but also capable of leading the country through the trials that lay ahead. As Europe hurtled toward war in the early 20th century, Winston Churchill found himself at the epicenter of Britain's military and political preparation. By 1911, as First Lord of the Admiralty, He had already begun to implement sweeping reforms within the Royal Navy, aiming to strengthen Britain's naval dominance in the face of growing competition from Germany. However, the rise of military tensions in Europe would soon prove that Churchill's leadership and vision would be tested in ways he could never have anticipated. One of Churchill's most important contributions to Britain's military preparedness was his focus on modernization. By 1911, Germany had begun an aggressive naval expansion under the leadership of Kaiser Wilhelm II, challenging Britain's previously unquestioned dominance on the seas. Churchill understood that maintaining Britain's naval superiority was not only crucial for the defense of the British Empire, but also for the survival of Britain's global influence. The world was rapidly changing, and Churchill believed that to secure Britain's future, the Navy needed to embrace technological innovations and modernization. To counter Germany's growing fleet, Churchill championed the construction of the dreadnought battleship, a revolutionary vessel that rendered older ships obsolete. These new battleships were faster, more heavily armed, and more technologically advanced. Churchill believed that this technological leap was essential for Britain to maintain its naval edge. At the time, many in the British establishment were hesitant about such a radical investment, but Churchill's persistence won out. By the time the war began in 1914, the Royal Navy was more formidable and better equipped than ever before. However, Churchill's vision extended beyond the Navy. He also recognized the changing nature of warfare, particularly the growing importance of aviation and submarine warfare. Britain's ability to harness new technologies like aircraft and submarines was becoming increasingly critical in both defense and offensive operations. While these ideas were often met with resistance by more traditional military leaders, Churchill pushed ahead, recognizing the potential for future wars to be fought not just by armies, but through air and naval dominance. His foresight would later prove invaluable during the First World War. As Britain's military was preparing for the inevitable conflict, Churchill's position as First Lord of the Admiralty gave him a unique opportunity to shape Britain's military strategy. However, his influence was not limited to the Navy alone. Churchill was deeply involved in the broader political and military discussions, particularly as tensions with Germany grew. When war finally broke out in July 1914, it did not come as a complete surprise to Churchill. While many had hoped that diplomacy would prevail, Churchill had long been preparing for the possibility of conflict. His knowledge of European politics, combined with his military insight, made him one of the leading figures in Britain's early response to the war. When Britain declared war on Germany, Churchill's leadership at the Admiralty would be put to the ultimate test. Churchill was determined to ensure that Britain's naval strategy would play a pivotal role in the conflict. His early actions in World War I focused on ensuring the protection of key trade routes, the deployment of forces to critical areas, and the blockade of Germany to cut off vital supplies. The Navy's control of the seas would be a critical factor in Britain's ability to sustain the war effort, and Churchill, as its chief architect. Despite these early preparations, the war revealed some stark realities. While Britain's Navy was undoubtedly powerful, it was not enough to prevent the devastating losses that would occur on land. The stalemate on the Western Front, combined with the loss of life in the trenches, highlighted the limitations of Britain's previous military strategies. But Churchill's adaptability and willingness to rethink traditional strategies would prove essential in the months and years that followed. Churchill's role during the early stages of World War I was marked by his bold vision for modernizing Britain's military and his unwavering belief that Britain's technological edge would prove decisive. However, the realities of war were often harsh and unpredictable. Churchill's ability to lead during these early days would be tested time and time again, but his foresight, passion, and commitment to victory would make him an indispensable figure as Britain entered one of its darkest and most challenging periods in history. In 1915, amidst the growing carnage of World War I, Winston Churchill found himself at the center of one of the most controversial military operations of the war, the Gallipoli Campaign. Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, had long advocated for a bold, decisive strategy to break the deadlock on the Western Front and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. His vision was to open a new front through the Dardanelles Strait, a narrow waterway that separated Europe from Asia, and to advance toward Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. The plan was audacious, but Churchill believed it was necessary to strike at the heart of the enemy's power, weakening the Central Powers while giving the Allies a much-needed morale boost. The campaign began in February 1915 with a naval assault aimed at breaching the Dardanelles. But the operation quickly became bogged down in a series of missteps and unforeseen challenges. Churchill's plan was to send a combination of naval ships and land forces to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula, which would eventually lead to the capture of Istanbul. However, the plan was based on an overestimation of the difficulty of the task and a grave underestimation of the resistance that Britain would face. The initial naval attack on the Dardanelles proved disastrous. The British fleet, which had sailed into the narrow strait expecting an easy victory, encountered fierce resistance from the Ottoman defenders. The fleet was forced to retreat, and this failure was a harsh blow to Churchill's confidence in the operation. However, rather than abandoning the campaign, Churchill pushed forward with a plan to send ground forces to land on the Gallipoli Peninsula, hoping that a combined naval and land assault would force the Ottomans to surrender. In April 1915, Anzac troops, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, along with British forces, began landing at Gallipoli. What followed was a brutal and costly stalemate. The soldiers, unprepared for the difficult terrain, were trapped in a series of bloody battles, unable to advance further while the Ottoman forces, entrenched in their positions, mounted fierce resistance. What Churchill and many others had expected to be a swift and decisive operation turned into a protracted and bloody siege, with no clear victory in sight. The Gallipoli campaign soon became a quagmire, with heavy casualties on both sides. For months, the Allies struggled to gain any significant ground. The landings at Gallipoli were marked by failures of leadership, poor planning, and a severe lack of coordination. The terrain was treacherous, and the Ottoman forces were much more resilient than anticipated. The harsh conditions and diseases, like dysentery and malaria, claimed the lives of thousands of men. By the time the campaign was finally called off in January 1916, it had cost the lives of over 200,000 Allied troops, and the failure had become a national humiliation for Britain and its allies. Churchill, as the chief architect of the Gallipoli operation, faced an overwhelming wave of criticism. Many blamed him for pushing forward with a plan that was poorly executed, based on overly optimistic assumptions, and ultimately disastrous. The failure of Gallipoli marked a significant setback in Churchill's political career. He was widely blamed for the military disaster, and the public perception of his leadership began to sour. Churchill resigned from his position as First Lord of the Admiralty in the aftermath of the failure, though he did not retreat from public life entirely. The Gallipoli disaster had profound effects on Churchill, both personally and professionally. For a man who had built his career on bold ideas and ambition, the campaign's failure was a humbling experience. He was forced to reflect on the limits of his strategic thinking, the importance of carefully considering all factors before committing to an operation, and the need for meticulous planning in military campaigns. Churchill himself would later describe Gallipoli as one of the most painful episodes of his career. Despite the devastating setback, Churchill's resilience would prove invaluable in his later years. His refusal to be defeated by the Gallipoli failure allowed him to rebuild his political career, eventually returning to government and continuing to rise in prominence. However, the mistakes made during the Gallipoli campaign would serve as a powerful lesson in leadership, military strategy, and the consequences of overestimating one's own capabilities. It also solidified his resolve to never shy away from taking risks, a characteristic that would define him throughout his life, particularly when he would be called upon to lead Britain during World War II. The catastrophic failure of the Gallipoli campaign in 1915 left Winston Churchill reeling both personally and professionally. After being blamed for the disastrous operation, Churchill was forced to resign from his position as First Lord of the Admiralty. For the first time in years, the indomitable figure of Churchill, known for his unyielding drive and ambition, found himself on the outside of political power, his reputation tarnished by one of the most significant failures of the war. Churchill's resignation marked a moment of deep introspection. For a man who had risen quickly to the highest echelons of political life, Gallipoli was an undeniable blow. He was vilified in the press, and many of his colleagues in the government distanced themselves from him. But Churchill, ever resilient, refused to be defined by failure. Instead of retreating from public life, he chose a path that would take him away from the limelight, but offer an opportunity for personal growth and eventual political rehabilitation. For much of 1916 and 1917, Churchill withdrew from the political scene. He briefly served in a military capacity, joining the Royal Scots Fusiliers and returning to the front lines in France, where he served in the trenches. This time in the field, away from the political chaos, allowed Churchill to reflect on the strategic mistakes of Gallipoli and the lessons he had learned. The experience also gave him a deeper understanding of the realities of modern warfare, a perspective that would inform his decisions in the coming years. His time in the military also rekindled his sense of purpose. Churchill found that, although the war was full of tragedy and devastation, he could make a difference in his country's fight against tyranny. As he had done earlier in his career, he threw himself into his work, committed to overcoming the setbacks he had faced. But despite his return to active service, Churchill knew that to truly rebuild his political career, he needed to regain the trust of the British public and the political establishment. In 1917, as Britain's involvement in the war continued to deepen and the political climate shifted, Churchill began to edge his way back into government. By this point, David Lloyd George had replaced Herbert Asquith as Prime Minister, and he sought to form a coalition government that would address the mounting crises of the war. Churchill, despite his past, was seen by Lloyd George as someone with the energy, intelligence, and drive to contribute to the war effort in a more senior role. In November 1917, Churchill was brought back into the cabinet as Minister of Munitions, a post that gave him significant authority over the country's war production. His role was critical during a time when the demand for munitions and military equipment was reaching unprecedented levels. As Minister of Munitions, Churchill was able to leverage his organizational and leadership skills to streamline production, ensuring that Britain's forces were adequately supplied for the continued conflict. Churchill's return to government marked the beginning of his recovery from the Gallipoli disaster. He embraced the opportunity to contribute to the war effort and restore his reputation. The work he did in the Ministry of Munitions demonstrated his resilience and commitment to Britain's victory, but it also showcased his capacity for transformation. Churchill had not only learned from his mistakes, but he had evolved as a leader. He was now more focused, more pragmatic, and more attuned to the complexities of warfare and political life. Though his time in the Ministry of Munitions was just one chapter in a long and storied career, it laid the foundation for Churchill's political comeback. His achievements during this period did not go unnoticed, and he began to rebuild the trust of his peers and the public. By the end of the First World War, Churchill had regained much of the political standing he had lost, setting the stage for his eventual return to power in the years to come. Despite the failure of Gallipoli, Churchill's resilience and determination ensured that his political career would not be over. He had not only learned from the mistakes of the past, but had used those lessons to emerge as a stronger, more focused leader. His ability to rise from the ashes of failure would become one of his most defining characteristics, a trait that would serve him well in the even greater challenges that lay ahead, particularly during the dark days of World War II. As World War I neared its end in 1918, Winston Churchill's reputation was beginning to recover. After his tumultuous period following the Gallipoli disaster, his work as Minister of Munitions had proven invaluable to Britain's war effort. Churchill's organizational acumen, coupled with his passion for the nation's success, allowed him to make a substantial impact on military production. Under his stewardship, Britain was able to provide essential supplies to the front lines, contributing to the eventual Allied victory. However, as the war ended, the challenges facing Britain were not over. The post-war period brought new difficulties, both for Churchill personally and for the country as a whole. The Great War had changed the geopolitical landscape, and Britain, though victorious, was deeply scarred by the immense loss of life and the economic toll the conflict had taken. It was clear that the world had changed, and Churchill, ever the visionary, sought to make his mark on this new era. In 1919, as the country began the process of recovery, Churchill was appointed to a new role as Secretary of State for War. This position placed him at the heart of the debates surrounding post-war reconstruction, defense, and the future of the British Empire. Churchill's political approach in the years following the war was marked by a firm belief in the strength and continuity of the British Empire, despite the war's impact on its global influence. One of Churchill's major concerns during this period was the fate of Europe in the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles. As the victorious powers met in Paris to negotiate peace terms, Churchill advocated for a more balanced and less punitive approach toward Germany. He understood that harsh reparations would breed resentment, potentially laying the groundwork for another conflict. However, his views were not fully embraced, and the treaty ultimately imposed heavy reparations on Germany, sowing the seeds for the rise of Nazism and the eventual outbreak of World War II. Churchill's role in shaping post-war policy also extended to his efforts to maintain British military power. He was concerned about the disarmament movement that swept through much of Europe, advocating for a strong military to maintain Britain's global influence. He believed that the British Army and Navy needed to be preserved at full strength, despite the financial strain of the war. His commitment to military preparedness was driven by a sense that Britain's dominance on the world stage was linked to its ability to project power and influence across the globe. While Churchill's vision for Britain's future was rooted in preserving the status quo, the world around him was changing rapidly. The rise of socialist movements, revolutions, and growing anti-imperial sentiment were challenging traditional systems of governance. In 1919, Churchill faced the growing tide of Labour Party influence, which was calling for sweeping reforms and an end to the power of the aristocracy and the monarchy. His hardline stance on empire and the maintenance of British power made him a controversial figure among the growing left-wing movement. In addition to his domestic concerns, Churchill remained deeply engaged in international affairs. He understood that Britain's global power was intertwined with the health of the international system and the balance of power in Europe. His foreign policy views during this period were shaped by his opposition to communism and the rise of the Soviet Union, which had just emerged from the Russian Revolution of 1917. Churchill, ever wary of the spread of Bolshevism, was a staunch advocate for intervention against the Soviet regime, seeing it as a threat to both Britain's security and to global stability. This anti-communist sentiment would become a hallmark of his policy approach throughout his career. Despite his prominent position in government, Churchill was beginning to feel the weight of public criticism. His views on empire, defense, and socialism often put him at odds with the more progressive elements of the political establishment. As the Labour Party gained strength and began to implement reforms, Churchill found himself increasingly on the political fringe. The post-war world was changing, and Churchill's vision of a powerful, imperial Britain was being challenged by the growing influence of new political movements. Yet, even in the face of mounting opposition, Churchill remained an influential figure within the Conservative Party. He never wavered in his belief that Britain's future lay in maintaining its military strength and global influence, and his voice continued to carry weight in national debates. The challenges of the post-war world were considerable, but Churchill's ability to navigate these turbulent times would prove essential, as he would soon face even greater challenges, particularly in the years leading up to the Second World War. The aftermath of World War I saw significant shifts in both Britain's political landscape and Churchill's own standing within it. The Labour Party, having gained considerable influence during the war, was now poised to push for sweeping social reforms. As the government struggled to address the consequences of the war, including unemployment, economic stagnation, and the push for workers' rights, Churchill found himself increasingly at odds with the direction in which Britain was headed. His vision of a strong, imperial Britain was being overshadowed by calls for social justice, welfare reforms, and a radical shift in how Britain was governed. Churchill, who had always believed in the importance of a powerful state, now became an outspoken critic of the growing power of the working class and the labor movement. His association with the Conservative Party made him an obvious figurehead for the fight against socialism. He was especially vocal in his opposition to the rise of socialist policies, including nationalization and the expansion of the welfare state. Churchill believed that the traditional social order, with its established hierarchy and imperial power, was essential to Britain's prosperity. In 1924, the Labour Party won a significant victory, forming its first government under Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. Churchill viewed this as a pivotal moment, a time when Britain's long-standing social structure was under serious threat. He was vehemently opposed to many of Labour's policies, particularly those related to the nationalization of industry and the expansion of the welfare state. Churchill saw these policies as a dangerous move towards socialism, a system he felt was incompatible with Britain's historical values and its future success. During this period, Churchill began to feel increasingly isolated. His vocal opposition to Labour's rise, combined with his growing discontent with the Conservative Party's leadership, led him to a crossroads. His views on Britain's role in the world, its commitment to empire, and its capitalist foundations were at odds with the changing attitudes of the British electorate. The rise of the Labour Party represented a challenge to everything Churchill had believed in for much of his career. In the early 1920s, Churchill also began to focus on Britain's place in the world, particularly in relation to its imperial interests. He believed that the decline of the British Empire would not only weaken Britain's global influence, but also diminish its status as a leading power. Churchill's staunch defense of the empire became one of the key features of his post-war political identity. He feared that the rise of Labour and the increasing strength of trade unions would erode Britain's imperial structure and ultimately harm its interests abroad. Despite his opposition to the growing socialist agenda, Churchill did not fully align with the Conservative Party's more reactionary factions. In fact, his relationship with the Conservative Party was increasingly strained. His support for imperialism, his opposition to Labour's social reforms, and his outspoken criticism of the government's handling of the post-war recovery made him a divisive figure. Churchill's views were becoming more isolated, and his leadership within the Conservative Party was no longer as unquestioned as it had been in the past. At the same time, Churchill's personal political fortunes were in decline. His increasing isolation within the Conservative Party led to his temporary political eclipse. In 1929, after a series of electoral defeats and his growing alienation from the leadership of the Conservative Party, Churchill was effectively sidelined. The public's attention had shifted to the Labour Party's new vision for a more egalitarian society, and Churchill found himself increasingly irrelevant to the political conversation. It seemed that his time at the forefront of British politics had come to an end. However, even in the face of this political setback, Churchill's determination to shape the future of Britain never waned. He understood that the world was changing, and though his vision of Britain's future was no longer popular, he remained committed to his beliefs. The years of political isolation would only serve to strengthen his resolve. It was during this period of retreat that Churchill would begin to formulate many of the ideas that would guide him during his later leadership, particularly his belief in Britain's need to maintain a strong, influential role in global affairs. The rise of the Labour Party and the decline of the British Empire would be key issues that Churchill would grapple with for the rest of his career. His stance on these issues would form the basis of many of the decisions he would make in the coming decades, particularly as Britain faced the mounting threat of totalitarian regimes in Europe. For Churchill, the struggle to preserve Britain's global role and its traditional values was a lifelong battle, one that would lead him back to prominence in the years before World War I. As Europe marched toward the inevitable outbreak of World War I in 1914, Winston Churchill remained ever vigilant to the growing threats posed by Germany and its increasingly aggressive stance on the international stage. Despite the fact that Britain was not yet directly involved in the conflict, Churchill recognized that the balance of power in Europe was rapidly shifting, and he was determined to ensure that Britain was prepared to face the challenges that lay ahead. By the time World War I broke out, Churchill had already established himself as a key figure in British military and political strategy. His tenure as First Lord of the Admiralty had seen him spearhead significant reforms within the Royal Navy, ensuring that Britain would have a formidable force at sea. However, Churchill was acutely aware that the naval might of Britain alone would not be enough to safeguard the country's interests. The rise of Germany, especially under the leadership of Kaiser Wilhelm II, had shifted the European power dynamics, and Churchill understood that Britain's military strategy needed to evolve. Churchill's pre-war vision was built around the idea that Britain could not afford to ignore the growing militarization of Europe. Germany's rapid expansion of its army and navy, combined with its increasing influence in global geopolitics, presented a clear and present danger to Britain's traditional dominance. Churchill was particularly concerned with the development of Germany's powerful naval fleet, which threatened to rival Britain's historically unchallenged maritime supremacy. In the years leading up to 1914, Churchill pushed for increased investment in the Royal Navy to maintain Britain's naval superiority. He advocated for the construction of more advanced warships and submarines, as well as the development of new technologies that would allow Britain to counter any emerging threats. He argued that Britain's survival depended on its ability to maintain control over the seas, as the British Empire was built on its naval power. Despite his focus on military preparation, Churchill was also deeply involved in the political and diplomatic aspects of Britain's role in Europe. He was a strong advocate for the Triple Entente, an alliance between Britain, France, and Russia, which was designed to counterbalance the growing strength of Germany. Churchill believed that Britain's strategic interests were best served by maintaining a strong relationship with France and Russia, both of whom shared concerns about Germany's increasing militarism. He recognized that a unified front with these countries was essential if Britain was to safeguard its influence in Europe and protect its empire. Churchill was also an early advocate for intervention in the escalating tensions between European powers. While many in Britain hoped that war could be avoided, Churchill's political instincts told him that Germany's ambitions were incompatible with Britain's interests. He saw the coming war not as a distant possibility, but as a near certainty, and he was determined to position Britain as a key player in the coming conflict. In 1914, as war broke out across Europe, Churchill's foresight was proven correct. Britain, along with France and Russia, found itself fighting against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Though Britain had hoped to remain on the sidelines, the events of the early days of the war quickly drew the country into the conflict. The war, however, would not play out in the way that many had expected. The brutal realities of trench warfare, combined with the stalemate on the Western Front, exposed the limitations of Britain's military strategies and forced Churchill to reconsider many of his earlier assumptions. Even as the war intensified, Churchill remained deeply involved in the military strategy of the Allied forces. His tenure as First Lord of the Admiralty was marked by his continuing efforts to bolster Britain's naval capabilities. Despite the setbacks of the early war years, Churchill was unwavering in his belief that Britain's naval power would ultimately prove decisive. However, the failure of the Gallipoli campaign, which he had championed, was a stark reminder that the path to victory was never guaranteed and that his own leadership decisions would be scrutinized by both his contemporaries and history. As the war dragged on and Britain suffered immense casualties, Churchill's role continued to evolve. Though the failure of Gallipoli had shaken his confidence, Churchill's commitment to the war effort remained steadfast. His ability to learn from past mistakes, adapt his strategies, and continually push for new solutions would be key to his eventual rise to prominence in the political and military spheres once again. His vision for a Britain that could stand tall on the world stage, powered by an unmatched navy and a forward-thinking military strategy, would continue to guide him throughout the war and beyond. As the dust settled after the conclusion of World War I, the victorious Allied powers turned their attention to the daunting task of rebuilding a war-torn world. Winston Churchill, who had been sidelined after the failure of the Gallipoli campaign, was now poised for a political comeback. Despite the challenges he had faced during the war, Churchill remained determined to restore his reputation and play a significant role in shaping the future of Britain and the wider world. After his resignation in 1915, Churchill had spent much of the next few years reflecting on his mistakes and regaining his standing in the political world. His brief return to military service, particularly in France, had given him a new perspective on the realities of warfare. While his time in the trenches was not long, it cemented Churchill's determination to ensure that Britain would never again face a war without adequate preparation and foresight. By the end of the war in 1918, Churchill was ready to take on a new leadership role, leveraging the lessons of the past and his years of experience in government. The post-war period was a time of great political and social upheaval. The Conservative Party was struggling to define its direction after the war, and the Labour Party, having gained strength during the conflict, was becoming a formidable political force. Amidst these changes, Churchill found himself at crossroads. While his political future was uncertain, his leadership experience and vision for Britain's future made him a critical figure in the evolving political landscape. In 1918, Churchill was appointed as Minister of Munitions once again, a position that allowed him to oversee Britain's post-war recovery and the transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime one. Churchill's time in this role marked a pivotal moment in his career, as it allowed him to influence key decisions about the country's reconstruction. His focus was not just on rebuilding Britain's economy, but also on ensuring that the military remained strong and prepared for any future conflicts. Churchill's experience in the Ministry of Munitions revealed the depth of his vision for Britain's post-war future. He understood that the war had irrevocably changed the geopolitical landscape, and Britain's power was now being challenged by the rise of new political movements, including socialism and communism. One of the key aspects of Churchill's post-war vision was his unwavering belief in the continued importance of the British Empire. Despite the growing tide of anti-imperial sentiment and the pressure for decolonization, Churchill remained a staunch defender of Britain's imperial power. He viewed the British Empire as both a source of economic strength and a way to maintain Britain's influence on the global stage. In addition to his focus on empire, Churchill's post-war vision for Britain also centered on national defense and military readiness. Having witnessed the devastating impact of war, Churchill was deeply committed to ensuring that Britain was always prepared to face future challenges. He continued to push for investment in the Royal Navy and the development of advanced military technologies, understanding that Britain's security and global influence would depend. However, Churchill's return to prominence was not without its challenges. His political views, particularly his strong advocacy for the British Empire and his opposition to socialism, often put him at odds with the rising Labour Party. In 1918, the Labour Party had gained significant traction, and by 1924, it would form its first government under Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. Churchill's belief in a traditional, capitalist Britain made him a prominent critic of the Labour Party's socialist agenda, especially as it sought to nationalize industry and increase government control over the economy. His staunch opposition to these policies created significant divisions between him and the more progressive factions of British politics. Despite the political challenges, Churchill's commitment to Britain's strength and influence remained unshaken. His views on defense, empire, and the role of the state in society were at odds with many of the emerging political movements of the time. However, his determination to defend Britain's traditional values would ultimately be what propelled him back into the political spotlight in the years leading up to World War II. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Churchill's political trajectory was on the rise once again. His leadership experience, commitment to Britain's military strength, and unwavering belief in the empire made him a critical figure in British politics. Though the Labour Party was gaining ground, Churchill's vision for a strong, imperial Britain and his opposition to socialist reforms would shape his actions in the coming years, eventually leading him to the position of Prime Minister. Churchill's post-war comeback was not merely a return to the political arena. It was the beginning of a new chapter in his career. His vision for Britain's future, combined with his resilience in the face of political setbacks, would ultimately allow him to play a central role in leading the nation through the turbulent years of the 1930s and the challenges of World War I. In the years following World War I, Winston Churchill faced a period of political and personal challenges that would test his resilience. While the war had ended in victory for the Allies, the world was left in ruins, and Britain's future was uncertain. The economy was struggling to recover, and the British Empire, though still vast, was beginning to show signs of strain. The rise of new political ideologies, particularly socialism and communism, added to the volatile atmosphere of the interwar period. For Churchill, this was a time of political isolation, as his views on empire and defense were increasingly at odds with the changing political climate in Britain. During the 1920s and early 1930s, Churchill found himself out of favor with many of his fellow conservatives. He had become a vocal critic of the growing Labour Party and the rise of socialist movements, and his unwavering support for the British Empire made him a divisive figure within his own party. The growing Labour influence in Britain, combined with the increasing power of the trade unions, meant that Churchill's vision of a strong, capitalist Britain was facing mounting opposition. His belief in the importance of a powerful military and a globally influential Britain was increasingly seen as outdated by many of his contemporaries. However, it was Churchill's outspoken warnings about the growing threat of Nazi Germany that would set him apart from the majority of British politicians in the years leading up to World War II. As early as the mid-1920s, Churchill began to raise alarms about the rise of Adolf Hitler and the growing power of the National Socialist movement in Germany. At a time when many in Britain were still recovering from the horrors of World War I, and when the prevailing sentiment was one of appeasement toward Germany, Churchill stood virtually alone in his calls for vigilance and action. In 1925, Churchill wrote an article in the Daily Mail, where he expressed his growing concern about the direction of German politics under Hitler. He warned that Hitler's ambitions were far greater than a mere desire for territorial expansion. He saw the rise of the Nazi leader as a threat to the entire European order. Churchill's concerns about Germany were not just about its military might, but also about the deeply anti-Semitic and totalitarian ideology that was beginning to take hold in the country. As Hitler's rhetoric became more aggressive and his military buildup more pronounced, Churchill's warnings grew louder. Despite his concerns, Churchill was met with resistance from much of the British political establishment. Many politicians, still recovering from the economic and human costs of the Great War, were reluctant to confront the reality of a rising Nazi Germany. The British public, exhausted by the horrors of war, was largely focused on rebuilding the economy and preserving peace at all costs. The policy of appeasement, most notably advocated by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, sought to avoid confrontation with Hitler in the hopes of preserving peace. But Churchill, with his prescient vision, saw this approach as dangerously misguided. Churchill's warnings about Hitler were not always well received in Britain, and for much of the late 1920s and early 1930s, he found himself increasingly isolated politically. His position on German rearmament was at odds with the general consensus, which favored reducing military spending and focusing on economic recovery. His staunch defense of British imperial interests also made him a target of criticism, as the world seemed to be moving away from colonial empires in favor of more progressive, anti-imperialist policies. Nevertheless, Churchill's fierce independence and determination to speak out against the dangers posed by Hitler would eventually prove crucial as Europe moved closer to the outbreak of war. Despite being sidelined during these years, Churchill's warnings and foresight about the rise of Nazi Germany would serve him well as Britain faced the approaching storm of World War II. His ability to recognize the threat when others were blinded by the desire for peace marked him as a leader who would eventually lead Britain through its darkest hour. The early 1930s were a time of profound political isolation for Winston Churchill. After his resignation from the government in 1929, following the Labour Party's rise to power, Churchill found himself outside the political mainstream, increasingly at odds with the policies of both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. While Britain was focused on economic recovery and avoiding further conflict after the devastation of World War I, Churchill saw the political landscape shifting in a dangerous direction, particularly with the rise of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. Throughout much of the 1930s, Britain's political establishment, including Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and other prominent figures, adopted a policy of appeasement toward Germany. They believed that by making concessions to Hitler, particularly regarding his territorial expansion, they could avoid another catastrophic war. The British public, exhausted by the horrors of the Great War and eager for peace, largely supported this approach, hoping to avoid further conflict at any cost. However, Churchill, ever the contrarian, vehemently opposed the policy of appeasement. He believed that Hitler's ambitions were far greater than merely reclaiming lost territories, and that Britain's reluctance to confront him would lead to even greater conflict in the future. Churchill's warnings fell largely on deaf ears, as he found himself increasingly marginalized in British political life. His strong, uncompromising stance against appeasement made him a vocal critic of his own party and its leadership. As the German rearmament program accelerated, Churchill warned that allowing Hitler to defy the Treaty of Versailles and build a powerful military would invite disaster. Churchill's views on Germany and the policy of appeasement were not widely popular in the early 1930s. At the time, Britain was still reeling from the economic fallout of the Great Depression, and the prevailing public sentiment favored avoiding war at almost any cost. Many in the Conservative Party, along with much of the British public, believed that the horrors of World War I were too fresh, and they sought peace rather than confrontation. Chamberlain, who would become Prime Minister in 1937, was particularly keen on negotiating with Hitler to avoid war, and this became a cornerstone of his foreign policy. One of Churchill's most vocal critiques was against the 1935 Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which allowed Germany to build a navy that would rival Britain's. Churchill saw this agreement as a critical mistake. By allowing Germany to rebuild its military strength, Britain and France were sending the dangerous message that they were unwilling to challenge Hitler's ambitions. Churchill believed that this was not only a violation of the Treaty of Versailles, but also a sign of weakness in Britain's international posture. Throughout the mid-1930s, Churchill's warnings about Germany's growing power and the failure of appeasement policies continued to be ignored by the government. Even as Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936 and began openly challenging the Treaty of Versailles, Churchill stood as one of the few voices calling for Britain to take a firm stance against Germany's violations. His speeches in Parliament were filled with urgency, as he passionately argued that Germany was not simply seeking the restoration of lost territories, but was instead determined to reshape Europe according to Nazi ideals. Despite his warnings, Churchill's position remained largely isolated. The Conservative Party, much of the public, and even many of his own colleagues were unwilling to confront the reality of Hitler's plans. The trauma of the Great War loomed large, and the idea of confronting Germany seemed unimaginable to many. Churchill, however, refused to back down. He argued that the best way to prevent war was to stand firm against aggression before it escalated into something far worse. His repeated calls for rearmament, as well as his insistence on strong alliances with France and other European powers, were dismissed by those in power who believed that appeasing Hitler would bring stability to Europe. Churchill's isolation was not just political. It was deeply personal. His calls for military buildup and his opposition to the government's foreign policy caused a rift with many of his conservative peers. He was seen as a hawk in an era dominated by doves, a figure whose aggressive stance against Germany and his commitment to imperial power were at odds with the prevailing public mood for peace. But as Hitler's territorial ambitions grew, Churchill's warnings would increasingly gain traction, and the rising tension in Europe would soon force even the most reluctant politicians to reconsider their stance on Germany. Churchill's political isolation in the 1930s only deepened his determination to warn Britain about the coming storm. His vocal opposition to appeasement would eventually prove to be prophetic. As Europe edged closer to the brink of war, Churchill's influence would begin to grow once again as the political climate shifted and the British people recognized the validity of his warnings. Despite years of marginalization, Churchill's unwavering conviction and clear-eyed vision of the future would eventually position him as the leader Britain would need in the darkest hours of World War II. By the late 1930s, the signs of impending war were becoming increasingly clear, and Winston Churchill's warnings about Nazi Germany were no longer dismissed as alarmist. Hitler's aggressive actions across Europe, combined with his rhetoric about expanding the Third Reich, made it apparent that war was on the horizon. Churchill, who had long advocated for Britain's rearmament and a stronger stance against Germany, was now one of the few political figures with a clear, unwavering stance on the issue. His calls for action had become more urgent as the world edged closer to another catastrophic conflict. The first major signal of Hitler's ambitions came in 1936, when German troops re-entered the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized under the Treaty of Versailles. The action was a direct violation of the peace agreement, yet France and Britain took no significant action in response. This failure to act emboldened Hitler, who continued to pursue his expansionist agenda. Churchill, once again, was one of the few who recognized the significance of this act of aggression. He warned that Germany's remilitarization of the Rhineland was not just a challenge to the Versailles Treaty, but a clear indication of Hitler's larger plans to undermine European stability. Churchill was already sounding the alarm over the growing threat of Nazi Germany, and his concern was compounded by the appeasement policies being pursued by the British government, led by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain, like many of his contemporaries, was determined to avoid another war and believed that negotiating with Hitler would prevent future conflict. But Churchill, ever the realist, saw appeasement as a dangerous strategy that only served to give Hitler more confidence and more territorial gains without consequence. In 1938, as Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a significant ethnic German population, Chamberlain's government once again chose to appease him. The Munich Agreement, signed by Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, allowed Hitler to annex the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further territorial expansion. For many, this agreement was hailed as a triumph of diplomacy. Chamberlain famously returned from Munich declaring that he had secured peace for our time. However, Churchill was not deceived by the superficial calm this accord offered. He immediately condemned the Munich Agreement as a betrayal and a failure of leadership. In his view, the agreement had allowed Hitler to gain more territory without any meaningful concessions, further emboldening the Nazi regime. Churchill's outspoken criticism of appeasement and his insistence that Britain prepare for war were becoming increasingly prescient. By this time, Germany's military was significantly stronger, and Hitler had already begun to build alliances with fascist regimes in Italy and Japan. Meanwhile, Britain's military readiness remained weak. Churchill, who had been a vocal advocate for rearmament since the early 1930s, had been ignored and marginalized by the government for years. However, as the global situation deteriorated, the British establishment began to see the merit of his warnings. In 1939, as Hitler broke the terms of the Munich Agreement by invading Czechoslovakia, Churchill's voice gained more prominence. He became an increasingly central figure in British politics, calling for a full rearmament program that would prepare Britain to meet the growing threat. Churchill recognized that Britain's survival depended on its ability to outpace Germany's military buildup, particularly in terms of air power and naval strength. He pushed for the expansion of the Royal Air Force and the production of more modern warships, understanding that these would be critical to Britain's defense as the war approached. Churchill's calls for rearmament were initially met with resistance from many within the British government, who feared the financial burden that an accelerated military buildup would entail. However, as the crisis deepened, it became clear that Britain's military readiness was woefully inadequate. By 1939, with the Nazi-Soviet pact signed and the invasion of Poland imminent, Britain had no choice but to recognize the gravity of the situation. Churchill, now a leading figure in the political opposition, had been proven right. The policy of appeasement had failed, and Britain was on the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, following the German invasion of Poland, marked the culmination of the tension that had been building for years. Britain and France, now with little choice but to act, declared war on Germany. Churchill's long-standing warnings about Nazi expansionism and the need for rearmament had finally been validated. The political isolation Churchill had endured in the 1930s gave way to a position of central importance in Britain's leadership during the war. His determination to confront the growing threat of Nazi Germany would soon transform him into the leader Britain needed to survive the darkest hours of the Second World War. By the time Britain entered World War II in September 1939, Winston Churchill had firmly established himself as a staunch critic of the Nazi regime and the policy of appeasement. His warnings, ignored for much of the 1930s, had proven prescient, as Hitler's aggressive actions throughout Europe had brought the world to the brink of another catastrophic war. Now, in Britain's moment of crisis, Churchill was once again thrust into the political spotlight. In May 1940, following the resignation of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, Churchill was appointed as his successor. Although Churchill was a member of the Conservative Party, he had spent years in political opposition, often criticizing Chamberlain's approach to both domestic and foreign policy. But when Chamberlain stepped down, Churchill was the one chosen to lead the country in the face of the escalating war with Germany. His reputation for decisiveness, military knowledge, and unwavering opposition to appeasement made him the natural choice to guide Britain through the darkest days of the conflict. Churchill's appointment was met with a mixture of support and skepticism. Many admired his bravery and unyielding resolve in the face of Nazi aggression, but others questioned his ability to lead during such a critical time. Churchill had not held office for over a decade, and some doubted his ability to unite a nation that had been deeply divided over the policies of the previous government. Yet, for Churchill, there was no time to waste. Britain was facing an existential threat, and his leadership was needed more than ever. The situation Britain faced in the spring of 1940 was dire. The German invasion of France was already in full force, and the British Expeditionary Force, BF, along with French troops, was trapped in the port city of Dunkirk. As German forces swept through Belgium and northern France, Churchill was confronted with the grim reality that the French government was on the brink of collapse and that Britain might be left to fight alone against a much stronger and better equipped German war machine. Amidst the chaos of these early days, Churchill's leadership style quickly became evident. He was a man of action, determined to mobilize Britain's resources and rally the population to fight against the enemy. He immediately sought to shore up Britain's defenses, calling for increased production of weapons, ammunition, and aircraft, and organizing air raid preparations to protect British civilians from German bombings. He also pushed for the expansion of the Royal Air Force and a revitalization of the Navy, knowing that Britain's survival would depend on its ability to control the skies and seas. One of the first major challenges Churchill faced as Prime Minister was the evacuation of British and Allied forces from Dunkirk. Despite the overwhelming German onslaught, Churchill refused to give in to the idea of a negotiated peace with Nazi Germany. Instead, he made the bold decision to mount an evacuation effort, known as Operation Dynamo, to rescue as many British and French soldiers as possible from the besieged port. Over the course of 8 days, an astonishing number of soldiers, nearly 338,000, were evacuated across the English Channel, in what became a symbol of Britain's resolve and determination to keep fighting. Though the Dunkirk evacuation was a remarkable success, it was also a grim reminder of Britain's precarious position. The fall of France seemed imminent, and Britain was on its own in the fight against Hitler's forces. But Churchill refused to be deterred. His famous words, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall never surrender," became a rallying cry for the British people. Churchill understood that Britain's survival depended not just on military victory, but on the resolve and spirit of the people. He was determined to inspire the nation to stand firm, even in the face of overwhelming odds. In the months that followed, Churchill's leadership would be put to the ultimate test. As the Battle of Britain unfolded in the summer of 1940, Churchill's role as the rallying point for the nation became even more crucial. The German Luftwaffe launched a relentless bombing campaign against Britain, seeking to break the will of the British people and pave the way for a German invasion. Yet Churchill's unshakable belief in Britain's ability to withstand the onslaught, coupled with his unwavering support for the Royal Air Force, helped keep morale high. Churchill's leadership during these early months of the war laid the foundation for Britain's eventual triumph. His refusal to consider any peace negotiations with Hitler, his determination to rebuild Britain's military might, and his ability to inspire the British people were instrumental in ensuring that Britain would never surrender to Nazi domination. The stage was now set for a long and difficult struggle, but under Churchill's leadership, Britain was ready to stand firm in the fight for freedom. The summer of 1940 marked one of the most critical moments of World War II, as Nazi Germany launched its full-scale aerial assault on Britain. Known as the Battle of Britain, this intense campaign was fought in the skies over southern England and was crucial to Britain's survival. At the helm of the nation, Winston Churchill faced the daunting task of defending his country against an enemy that was both powerful and relentless. This was the moment when Churchill's leadership truly shone, as he inspired the British people to fight on, even when the odds seemed overwhelmingly stacked against them. In June 1940, after the fall of France and the evacuation of British forces from Dunkirk, Britain stood alone against Hitler's war machine. Hitler had already conquered much of Europe, and Britain was the last major European power standing. The threat of a German invasion was imminent, and the skies above Britain were now the battleground. The Luftwaffe launched wave after wave of bombers and fighters, aiming to break Britain's air defenses and prepare for a full-scale invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. Churchill, from the very beginning of the Battle of Britain, understood the importance of maintaining morale among the British people. His speeches, filled with defiance and determination, became legendary. The most famous of all was his speech in which he declared, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." This tribute to the pilots of the Royal Air Force, RAF, captured the spirit of the nation during those dark days. Churchill recognized that the survival of Britain did not rest on military might alone. It was the resolve and spirit of the people that would ultimately determine. Under Churchill's leadership, Britain's defenses were bolstered by the RAF, which, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, fought fiercely to repel the German attack. Churchill took a direct interest in the RAF strategy, working closely with his military commanders, including Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, to ensure that the RAF had the resources and support needed. He was fully aware of the significance of the battle. Losing the skies would make an invasion by Hitler's forces far more likely, and Churchill was determined to ensure that Britain would never surrender to Nazi domination. Despite the intensity of the German assault, Churchill refused to entertain the notion of peace talks with Hitler. Even as bombings devastated London and other cities, Churchill maintained a steady focus on the goal of victory. His leadership was a beacon of hope, both for the military and the civilians who were enduring the nightly bombings. Churchill's ability to connect with the people of Britain and bolster their resolve was one of his greatest strengths. He understood that victory would be won not just through strategy, but through the heart and soul of the nation. The battle itself was a turning point in the war. While the Luftwaffe inflicted significant damage on Britain's infrastructure and cities, the RAF inflicted even greater losses on Germany's air force. The Germans were unable to achieve air superiority, and Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. The Battle of Britain marked the first major defeat of Nazi Germany in the war, and it shattered the myth of German invincibility. It also showed the world that Britain was determined to fight on, no matter the cost. In addition to his role as a wartime leader, Churchill understood the importance of international alliances. By 1941, the situation was becoming increasingly dire, and Britain was still standing alone in Europe. Churchill turned to the United States for support, famously establishing a personal relationship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Churchill's ability to appeal to Roosevelt, despite the fact that the U.S. was not yet officially involved in the war, would ultimately lead to the Lend-Lease Act and increased military support from the United States. Churchill knew that Britain could not face Hitler alone, and he was determined to secure as much international support as possible. As Britain endured the constant bombing raids, Churchill's resolve was unwavering. He kept the nation focused on the goal of total victory over Nazism. His leadership during the Battle of Britain and the following months was crucial in preventing a German invasion and maintaining British morale. The battle became a symbol of resistance against tyranny, and Churchill emerged as one of the great wartime leaders in history. The Battle of Britain also cemented Churchill's reputation as a man who was not afraid to take bold decisions in times of crisis. His vision for the future of Britain, focused on resilience, unity, and unwavering resistance, would continue to guide the nation through the darkest days of the war. As the war raged on, Churchill's leadership would continue to be defined by his ability to inspire, to persevere, and to ensure that Britain would never surrender to Nazi aggression. As World War II raged across Europe, Churchill's leadership was increasingly defined not only by his courage on the home front, but also by his diplomatic efforts to secure crucial support from the United States. By 1940, Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. Although the Battle of Britain had been won, the situation remained precarious. Britain was running low on supplies, and its economy was strained. The looming threat of a German invasion was still very much present, and the possibility of victory seemed distant. Churchill knew that in order to sustain Britain's war effort, he would need more than just the bravery of his people and the dedication of his armed forces. He would need American assistance. At the time, the United States was not yet officially involved in the war. Despite the growing threat posed by Hitler, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was constrained by both public opinion and isolationist sentiment, which were strong in the U.S. Many Americans were still traumatized by their involvement in World War I and were reluctant to become entangled in another European conflict. Roosevelt, however, recognized the growing danger of Nazi-dominated Europe and the importance of aiding Britain, which was fighting on the front lines of freedom. In this critical moment, Churchill's diplomatic acumen came to the forefront. Even though Britain had not yet entered into a formal alliance with the United States, Churchill was determined to build a close relationship with Roosevelt. The two men formed a personal bond that would transcend diplomatic formalities. Churchill, ever the persuasive leader, was able to convince Roosevelt of the necessity of supporting Britain in its fight against Nazi Germany. He was able to secure Roosevelt's commitment to to provide essential war materials to Britain, even though the U.S. had not yet entered the war. Churchill's diplomacy led to the Lend-Lease Act, which was signed into law by President Roosevelt in March 1941. The act, which allowed the United States to send war supplies to nations whose defense was deemed vital to the United States' security, was a game-changer for Britain. This agreement would provide Britain with the much-needed resources to continue the fight against Nazi Germany, including tanks, aircraft, and food supplies, as well as critical raw materials. The Lend-Lease Act marked a pivotal shift in global politics, as it effectively made the United States the arsenal of democracy and guaranteed that Britain would not be left to fight alone. The significance of the Lend-Lease Act for Britain cannot be overstated. At the time, Britain was facing severe shortages of both military and civilian supplies. The ongoing bombing raids by the Luftwaffe had destroyed factories and infrastructure, and the British economy was on the brink of collapse. The Lend-Lease Agreement provided Britain with the means to keep its military fighting and its civilian population supplied. Churchill knew that without American aid, Britain's ability to withstand the Axis powers would be severely limited. One of Churchill's greatest diplomatic achievements during this period was his ability to convince Roosevelt to see beyond the isolationist pressures in the U.S. Roosevelt, while sympathetic to Britain's plight, had to contend with a deeply divided American public. Churchill understood the nuances of American politics and was able to navigate these sensitivities while making the case for Britain's survival. Through their correspondence and direct meetings, Churchill and Roosevelt built a deep personal friendship based on shared values and a common vision for the post-war world. In return, Churchill demonstrated unwavering commitment to collaboration with the United States, recognizing that the eventual defeat of the Axis powers would require a united effort from both nations. He did not just see Roosevelt as a source of material aid, but as a crucial partner in a broader international strategy to combat fascism and totalitarianism. As the war continued to unfold, the importance of the Churchill-Roosevelt alliance became increasingly apparent. The two leaders would work together to shape the strategic direction of the war, culminating in the planning of Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, and other key campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. Their close relationship would also lay the groundwork for the post-war international order, including the creation of the United Nations and the broader framework for the global peace that Churchill envisioned. The Lend-Lease Act and Churchill's diplomatic efforts were critical to Britain's survival during the early years of the war. Through his leadership, Britain not only secured vital resources, but also ensured that the fight against Nazi Germany was not waged alone. Churchill's ability to forge and strengthen alliances would prove to be one of the defining features of his wartime leadership. In the face of unimaginable adversity, he had rallied the support of the United States, ensuring that Britain could continue its fight for freedom and democracy. The summer of 1940 marked a pivotal moment in the history of World War II. Britain, having survived the dark days of the Dunkirk evacuation, now faced an even greater threat. Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, was poised to launch an invasion of Britain. The Battle of Britain, fought primarily in the skies, would become a critical turning point in the war, determining whether Britain could hold out against the German war machine or succumb to Nazi control. At the helm of the British government, Winston Churchill's leadership was tested as never before. Since taking office in May 1940, Churchill had worked tirelessly to rally the British people for the coming storm. His call for defiance in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds resonated deeply with the nation. But now, it was time for action. As the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, began its campaign of bombing raids against Britain's cities and military infrastructure, Churchill's resolve became the cornerstone of Britain's resistance. Churchill's leadership during the Battle of Britain was not just about military strategy. It was about inspiring a nation to hold firm against an enemy that seemed unbeatable. His speeches were filled with unwavering confidence and defiance. One of his most famous addresses to the nation was delivered in August 1940, in which he declared, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." This tribute to the Royal Air Force, RAF, pilots, who were defending Britain's skies with courage and determination, was a powerful reminder of the critical role that the RAF, and by extension, every Briton, would play in the survival of the nation. Despite the intense bombing raids, Churchill remained resolute in his belief that Britain must never surrender. Even as German bombers pounded British cities, Churchill knew that morale would be the key to victory. He made it a priority to boost the spirit of the British people, constantly emphasizing the idea that Britain's fight was not just for its survival, but for the survival of freedom itself. His presence during the Battle of Britain was one of fierce determination. He visited the bombed areas, showing solidarity with the civilians and military personnel who were enduring the wrath of the Luftwaffe. Churchill's leadership during this critical period was also marked by a deep understanding of the strategic importance of the Royal Air Force. The RAF, though smaller in numbers than the German Luftwaffe, was determined to protect Britain's airspace at all costs. Churchill worked closely with his military commanders, including Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, to ensure that the RAF had the resources it needed to continue the fight. Despite the odds, Churchill knew that the skies over Britain must be defended at all costs, as the Luftwaffe superiority would make any German invasion of Britain nearly unstoppable. As the battle raged on, Churchill became increasingly involved in the strategic decisions surrounding the defense of Britain. He understood that the war would be won or lost in the air, and he gave full support to the RAF's efforts to resist the German air assault. His personal commitment to victory in the Battle of Britain was evident in his daily involvement, offering advice to his military leaders, reassuring the public, and refusing to consider any compromise with the Nazis. Churchill's leadership also involved managing the growing pressures on Britain's military and civilian population. As the bombing raids continued, British civilians suffered immense hardship. But Churchill's ability to inspire and lift the national spirit helped to keep Britain united and focused on the goal of survival. He made it clear to the British people that their sacrifices were for a noble cause, one that would determine the future of not only Britain but the entire world. In many ways, Churchill's leadership during the Battle of Britain marked the moment when he became a symbol of British defiance. The early months of the battle were characterized by uncertainty and terror, but under Churchill's guidance, Britain held firm. The Battle of Britain was not just a military victory. It was a symbol of hope and resilience. As the RAF continued to thwart the German air offensive, it became clear that the Germans would not be able to achieve their goals of crushing Britain. The victory in the Battle of Britain was the first major defeat of Nazi Germany, and it was achieved in no small part due to Churchill's leadership. His determination to keep Britain fighting, even when the odds seemed impossible, galvanized the nation and the world. It was a moment when Britain, under Churchill's leadership, stood tall against tyranny and showed that the fight for freedom was far from over. As the Battle of Britain continued through the summer of 1940, Churchill's leadership became not only a symbol of defiance, but also a beacon for the coordination of the war effort across the globe. By this time, Britain had already established its resolve to fight on against Nazi Germany, but the situation was far from secure. While Britain stood firm, the rest of Europe was rapidly falling under Nazi control, and Britain was facing the possibility of isolation on the world stage. Churchill understood that to defeat Hitler, Britain could not do it alone. One of his first and most crucial decisions as Prime Minister was to forge stronger alliances, especially with the United States and the Soviet Union. While the United States had not yet entered the war in an official capacity, Churchill made it a priority to cultivate a strong relationship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who shared his concerns about the growing threat of Nazi expansion. Churchill's diplomatic efforts were relentless, as he sought to convince Roosevelt that a German victory would be disastrous not just for Britain, but for the entire world order. Despite the isolationist sentiment that was widespread in the United States, Roosevelt gradually came to understand the importance of supporting Britain. In March 1941, Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act, which provided essential war materials to Britain and its allies. This act marked a pivotal moment in the war, as it enabled Britain to continue its fight against Germany without the immediate need for direct American military involvement. Churchill's ability to secure the Lend-Lease Agreement was a significant diplomatic triumph. It marked a crucial step in strengthening the Anglo-American alliance, which would become one of the most vital partnerships of the war. With American support in the form of weapons, food supplies, and military equipment, Britain was able to continue its resistance against Nazi Germany, while also preparing for the eventual American entry into the war. Simultaneously, Churchill began to recognize the strategic importance of forging a relationship with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. While initially cautious, Churchill understood that the Soviets were pivotal in any long-term strategy to defeat Germany. The invasion of the Soviet Union by Hitler in June 1941, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, pushed Churchill to extend his support to Stalin, despite the ideological differences between the British Empire and the Communist Soviet regime. Churchill's decision to extend the hand of cooperation to Stalin, culminating in the Anglo-Soviet Agreement of 1941, marked a pragmatic shift in Britain's war strategy, aligning Britain with the Soviet Union against the common enemy. The cooperation between the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union formed the foundation of the Allied powers. Churchill's diplomatic skill in managing these complex relationships, each with its own set of challenges, was a key aspect of his leadership. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the war effort was coordinated across multiple fronts and that resources were shared strategically to weaken Nazi Germany from all angles. Churchill understood that the defeat of Hitler would require a unified, global effort that transcended national borders and ideological differences. Churchill's strategic decisions during this period were not limited to diplomacy. As Britain endured the nightly bombardments of the Blitz, Churchill worked closely with his military advisors to ensure that Britain's defenses were prepared for the inevitable escalation of the war. He made a concerted effort to bolster Britain's air defenses, especially after the success of the Battle of Britain, ensuring that the Royal Air Force remained equipped to face the growing Luftwaffe threat. In addition, Churchill continued to focus on military preparedness for a future offensive. While Britain was still reeling from the early months of the war, Churchill pushed for greater investments in strategic intelligence, military training, and logistical support for future Allied operations. In 1941, he also took the first steps in formulating plans for Operation Overlord, the eventual invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe, which would become a critical part of the Allied victory. But it wasn't just military and diplomatic strategies that defined Churchill's leadership. It was also his ability to maintain British morale during these incredibly trying times. The Blitz, the German bombing campaign aimed at breaking British resolve, caused untold devastation in cities across the country, particularly London. Yet, Churchill remained a symbol of hope. His nightly walks through bombed-out streets, visiting civilians and soldiers alike, reinforced the message that Britain would never surrender. He ensured that Britain's radio broadcasts, newspaper outlets, and public speeches consistently reinforced this spirit of resistance, even in the face of unimaginable hardship. At the same time, Churchill was acutely aware of the importance of keeping Britain's allies engaged. While the United States and the Soviet Union provided critical support, Churchill knew that Britain's success also depended on rallying support from Commonwealth nations like Canada, Australia, and India. Churchill's speeches emphasized the global nature of the war, positioning Britain as the beacon of freedom and democracy in the fight against tyranny. By the end of 1941, Britain had secured vital international support and had strengthened its defenses at home. Churchill's efforts to form strong alliances and his unrelenting focus on military strategy and morale helped Britain endure the early years of World War II. Though the war was far from over, Churchill had successfully positioned Britain as a leading force in the Allied fight against Nazi Germany, ensuring that the country would play a pivotal role in the ultimate defeat of the Axis powers. By 1941, the course of World War II was rapidly changing, and Churchill's leadership would again be tested by events beyond Britain's borders. The year began with both encouraging developments and daunting challenges. The Soviet Union was now engaged in full-scale war with Nazi Germany, and the United States had yet to formally enter the conflict. Churchill understood that the outcome of the war would hinge not just on Britain's survival, but also on maintaining critical alliances with the Soviet Union and the United States, both of whom were key to defeating Hitler's growing empire. The first seismic shift of 1941 occurred on June 22, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, against the Soviet Union. Hitler's decision to open up a second front, despite having a non-aggression pact with Stalin, was a gamble that would drastically alter the course of the war. The attack shattered the relative stability of the Eastern Front and brought the Soviet Union into direct conflict with Nazi Germany. Churchill, despite his ideological differences with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet regime, immediately recognized the strategic importance of supporting the USSR in this new phase of the war. Churchill's diplomatic acumen came to the forefront as he reached out to Stalin, extending Britain's full support to the Soviet Union. This marked a critical shift in British policy. Though Britain and the Soviet Union had little in common in terms of political ideology, the battle against the common enemy, Nazi Germany, far outweighed any differences. Churchill famously declared that if Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. Churchill's decision to support the Soviets, despite their communist ideology, was a strategic move that he knew would be crucial for the long-term success of the war effort. In doing so, he ensured that the Soviet Union would remain in the fight against Germany, which would eventually tie up crucial German resources on the Eastern Front and divide Hitler's forces. Churchill offered both moral support and military aid in the form of war materials, tanks, and aircraft, even though Britain itself was still reeling from the earlier phases of the conflict. This was a pragmatic, yet essential, alliance that would prove vital as the war progressed. While Churchill was focused on supporting the Soviet Union, the geopolitical situation was about to change dramatically with the entry of the United States into the war. In September 1940, Churchill and Roosevelt had already begun laying the groundwork for closer cooperation through the Atlantic Charter, which outlined the shared principles between the two nations: democracy, self-determination, and free trade. However, the United States remained officially neutral, bound by public opinion and the Neutrality Acts, which were designed to keep America out of the conflict. That changed dramatically on December 7, 1941, when Japan, an ally of Nazi Germany, launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, bringing the United States into the war. Churchill was quick to respond, not just with condolences, but with a declaration of Britain's full support for the United States. Within hours of the attack, Churchill addressed the British Parliament and famously declared, "We are all in the same boat now." He understood that this would be a defining moment in the war, a moment when the United States, with its immense industrial and military resources, would become a crucial ally in the fight against the Axis powers. Churchill had been advocating for U.S. involvement in the war for years, understanding that Britain could not stand alone against the combined might of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. With Roosevelt's commitment to the Allied cause, Britain now had a powerful partner, both in terms of military support and material resources. Churchill immediately worked to secure a closer military and strategic partnership with the United States, ensuring that the two nations would coordinate their efforts to defeat the Axis powers on both the European and Pacific fronts. The entry of the United States into the war provided a significant boost to Britain's ability to sustain its fight. It also meant that Churchill could begin to shift his focus toward planning joint military operations with the United States, most notably the eventual invasion of North Africa in 1942, which would set the stage for the liberation of Europe. The transatlantic alliance forged in the wake of Pearl Harbor was instrumental in the defeat of Germany and its allies. Churchill, working alongside Roosevelt, began to lay out plans for an eventual second front in Western Europe, knowing that the key to defeating Nazi Germany lay in attacking it from multiple fronts. While the entry of the United States into the war was a monumental shift, it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in Churchill's leadership. With Britain now backed by the military and economic power of the United States, the balance of the war began to tip in favor of the Allies. Churchill's ability to maintain strong relationships with his key allies, the United States and the Soviet Union, while keeping Britain's resolve strong in the face of adversity, would prove to be one of his greatest achievements as a wartime leader. As 1941 came to a close, Britain, with the full support of its new allies, entered the war's second phase with renewed confidence. The leadership, vision, and diplomatic skill Churchill demonstrated during this period would pave the way for future victories, ensuring that Britain would not just survive, but, with the help of its allies, ultimately triumph over Nazi Germany. As 1942 unfolded, the tides of World War II were beginning to turn in favor of the Allies, largely due to the critical leadership of Winston Churchill and the growing collaboration with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. While Britain was still under pressure from the Axis powers on multiple fronts, Churchill's strategic vision and diplomatic efforts played a pivotal role in shaping Allied military operations. The North African Campaign, in particular, became a focal point of these efforts, as the British sought to gain control of key territories in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Churchill had always recognized the strategic importance of North Africa, not only for its proximity to the Middle East and oil supplies, but also for its position as a vital launching pad for future Allied operations in Europe. In 1941, Britain had already engaged in significant military operations in North Africa, but by 1942, the situation had become more urgent. The German Afrika Korps, under the leadership of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was advancing rapidly across North Africa and threatening to gain control of key regions such as Egypt and the Suez Canal. If Rommel succeeded in securing these areas, it would significantly disrupt British access to vital supplies and could potentially open the way for a German invasion of the Middle East. Churchill's leadership in North Africa was defined by a combination of bold decisions and relentless determination. He knew that if the Axis powers were allowed to establish dominance in the region, it could have disastrous consequences for the war effort. However, he also understood that British forces, though resilient, were overstretched, and the campaign would require significant coordination with American forces. In January 1942, Churchill and Roosevelt convened for the Casablanca Conference, a crucial moment in their partnership. At this conference, the two leaders decided to focus on an all-out offensive against the Axis powers in North Africa. This was a turning point, as it marked the beginning of increased American involvement in the European theater. Roosevelt, who had already pledged support to Britain through the Lend-Lease Act, agreed to send more American troops and resources to help in the fight. Churchill's ability to persuade Roosevelt to prioritize North Africa over other potential fronts, like a direct invasion of Europe, was a significant diplomatic achievement. It was a decision that would later lay the groundwork for future Allied successes in the Mediterranean and Europe. The First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942 became a critical moment for Churchill. Rommel's forces had reached the outskirts of Egypt, and the situation seemed dire for the British. With the Suez Canal and access to the Middle East hanging in the balance, Churchill refused to allow Britain to lose ground. He had made a commitment to defend Egypt at all costs, and he placed his full support behind General Bernard Montgomery, who had been appointed to lead British forces in North Africa. The battle was a decisive turning point, as Montgomery's forces successfully halted the Axis advance. Although the battle was not a definitive victory, it gave the Allies the momentum they desperately needed. Churchill's involvement in the North African campaign wasn't just strategic, it was deeply personal. He was deeply committed to supporting the troops and making sure they had the resources they needed. In fact, during the Battle of El Alamein, Churchill famously made a visit to the front lines, showing solidarity with the men who were enduring harsh conditions in the desert. His unwavering belief in the ultimate victory of the Allies was a key source of inspiration for the troops, and his leadership helped rally them in the face of adversity. As the situation in North Africa began to improve, Churchill also had a focus on the bigger picture. The victory at El Alamein set the stage for the Allied invasion of Italy in 1943, marking the first significant push into Axis-controlled Europe. However, Churchill was acutely aware that the war could not be won in North Africa alone. He was already planning for the next phase of the war, the eventual invasion of Western Europe, which would require massive coordination between the Allies and a larger commitment from the United States. The North African campaign also helped to solidify the importance of the Anglo-American alliance in the overall strategy of the war. Churchill's ability to maintain strong relations with Roosevelt, despite their occasional differences, ensured that the Allies were unified in their efforts. While the American military leadership sometimes preferred to focus on the Pacific theater, Churchill consistently made the case for prioritizing the European front. His ability to work with Roosevelt, and later with Stalin, was crucial in ensuring that the Allies presented a united front against the Axis powers. By the end of 1942, the Allied forces had begun to push the Axis back across North Africa. The Allied victory of the Second Battle of El Alamein, combined with the successful Operation Torch in November 1942, which was the first major American-led invasion of Axis-held territory, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi ambitions in Africa. Churchill's strategic foresight and diplomatic efforts had paid off, and the momentum had shifted in favor of the Allies, Churchill's role in the North African campaign, while not without its challenges, demonstrated his ability to make bold decisions, rally international support, and inspire both military and civilian morale. His unwavering commitment to defeating the Axis powers, his adept diplomatic maneuvering, and his unrelenting pursuit of victory were crucial to the success of the Allied war effort. As Britain prepared for further confrontations with Nazi Germany and its allies, Churchill knew that the path to victory would be long and difficult, but the tide was finally beginning to turn. As 1943 unfolded, the war was entering a critical phase, with the Allied forces making significant strides in both the Mediterranean and the Pacific. Churchill's leadership during this period was marked not only by his military and diplomatic efforts, but also by his growing involvement in shaping the future of the post-war world. He was increasingly working alongside his two key allies, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin, to ensure a coordinated strategy for victory and to lay the groundwork for the world order that would emerge after the war. The Tehran Conference, held in November 1943, was a historic meeting between the Big Three: Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. For Churchill, this was a moment to ensure that Britain's interests were represented as the Allied powers moved closer to victory. The Tehran Conference was the first time that the three leaders would meet face-to-face, and it marked the beginning of a more formal collaboration among the Allies, which would shape the direction of the war and the post-war world. The primary topic of discussion at Tehran was the opening of a second front in Western Europe, which would eventually culminate in the Normandy invasion, D-Day. For Churchill, this was a long-awaited victory. Throughout the war, he had advocated for a direct assault on Nazi-controlled Europe. However, the United States had initially been focused on other fronts, including the Pacific Theater and North Africa. At Tehran, Roosevelt and Stalin finally agreed to the necessity of an invasion of Western Europe, which would be coordinated with the Soviet offensive on the Eastern Front. While the Tehran Conference was largely focused on military strategy, it also had significant political implications. The Anglo-American Soviet alliance was still in its early stages, and Churchill worked hard to ensure that Britain's voice was heard in these crucial discussions. Churchill's role at the Tehran Conference was that of a skilled mediator, balancing the competing demands of his two powerful allies. He was deeply aware that the future of Europe and the world depended on the cooperation of these three nations. For Churchill, the Tehran Conference also marked a significant shift in Britain's relationship with the Soviet Union. While he had long been wary of Stalin's intentions, he understood that the Soviet Union was now an indispensable ally in the fight against Nazi Germany. Churchill's pragmatism was evident in his willingness to work with Stalin, despite the ideological differences that separated the two leaders. The Soviet Union's sacrifice on the Eastern Front, where millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians were dying to stop the Nazi advance, made it clear that the fate of Europe would depend on Soviet involvement in the war effort. The Tehran Conference was also the beginning of more formal discussions about the post-war order. Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill began to lay the foundations for the United Nations, an international organization designed to promote peace and cooperation after the war. Churchill was deeply invested in ensuring that Britain's global influence would remain intact after the war. He was determined to protect the British Empire, which had been severely weakened by the war, but still represented a significant portion of the world's territories. At the same time, Churchill knew that the world would be irrevocably changed by the war, and he was prepared to accept certain compromises in the interest of maintaining international peace and stability. Despite the challenges of working with Stalin, Churchill emerged from the Tehran Conference with a sense of accomplishment. The conference solidified the agreement to open a second front in Western Europe, which would be crucial to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. It also marked a key moment in the development of the Allied strategy for victory. However, the Tehran Conference also exposed the tensions that would later emerge during the Cold War, particularly regarding the future of Eastern Europe and the balance of power between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. Churchill's ability to navigate these tensions and maintain a cohesive Allied front would be crucial as the war entered its final stages. By the end of 1943, Churchill had successfully steered Britain through some of the war's darkest moments. His leadership during the Battle of Britain, his unwavering defense of Britain's imperial interests, and his ability to maintain unity among the Allied powers had laid the foundation for future victories. But Churchill knew that the war was far from over. The invasion of Italy had just begun, and plans for the Normandy invasion were already in motion. The war in the Pacific was also intensifying, and it was clear that the final defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan would require unprecedented collaboration between the Allies. Churchill's leadership in 1943 would prove to be a defining moment in the war. His ability to navigate complex alliances, strategize military campaigns, and shape the political future of the post-war world would have a lasting impact on Britain and the international community. As 1944 approached, Churchill was prepared to face the next phase of the war, one that would bring the Allies closer to victory, but also bring new challenges in securing the peace that would follow. By the spring of 1944, the Allied forces were on the brink of launching what would become one of the most significant and daring military operations in history. D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. After years of fighting across multiple fronts, the time had come to open a second front in Western Europe, to challenge the Nazi occupation of France, and to turn the tide of the war against Adolf Hitler. For Winston Churchill, the D-Day operation was the culmination of years of planning, countless strategic meetings, and intense collaboration between the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Free French forces led by Charles de Gaulle. Churchill, along with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and General Dwight D. Eisenhower, was a key architect of the operation. The stakes were immense. The success of D-Day would determine whether the Allies could liberate Western Europe and ultimately defeat Nazi Germany, while failure could delay the Allied victory and cost countless lives. The planning for D-Day was an enormous logistical effort, involving careful coordination across multiple nations. The invasion would require not just troops, but also tanks, aircraft, and an unprecedented number of supplies, all of which had to be moved to the coast of England without detection by German forces. A critical component of the plan was the element of surprise. The Germans expected the invasion to take place elsewhere, likely in the Pas-de-Calais region, and were not prepared for the massive landing in Normandy. Churchill's leadership during this period was crucial. He understood that D-Day was not just a military operation. It was a symbol of Allied unity. The success of the operation relied on the cooperation between Britain, the United States, and France, and Churchill worked tirelessly to ensure that each nation's interests were respected. He had long championed the idea of opening a second front in Western Europe, believing it was essential for breaking Nazi Germany's hold on Europe. The planning for the invasion began in earnest after the Allied victory in Italy, but it was not until 1943 that the final decisions were made. The question of where to land was a matter of intense debate. Churchill, along with other Allied leaders, recognized the importance of choosing a location that could serve as a beachhead for further advances into Europe. Normandy, with its less defended coastline, was selected as the landing site. Churchill was deeply involved in every aspect of the operation. He attended many of the strategic meetings with Roosevelt and Eisenhower, offering input on military tactics, intelligence, and logistics. One of his key contributions was insisting on the importance of coordinating with the French resistance. Churchill believed that the success of D-Day would depend on a seamless relationship between the Allied forces and the French underground, which could help disrupt German communications, sabotage key installations, and provide intelligence on German positions. Churchill's commitment to the operation was unwavering. Despite the risks and the immense scale of the challenge, he fully supported the decision to push forward with D-Day, understanding that it was the moment that could shift the balance of the war. However, he also had a realistic understanding of the difficulties ahead. The invasion would require precise coordination and could lead to heavy casualties on both sides. As the date for the invasion neared, the pressure mounted. The weather played a key role in determining the timing of the invasion, and the Allies had to work quickly to ensure that they had everything in place for the planned launch on June 6, 1944. The operation involved a combination of land, sea, and air forces, the largest amphibious assault ever attempted. Churchill's leadership, alongside his military commanders, ensured that the operation was ready for launch. In the days leading up to D-Day, Churchill's role was to maintain the unity of the Allied leadership and keep morale high. He delivered several speeches, emphasizing the importance of the operation and urging the people of Britain to remain strong and hopeful. He also had to manage the delicate balance between military needs and public perception, knowing that the success of the invasion was critical not only for the war effort, but for the future of the Allied alliance. On the night before D-Day, Churchill gave a speech to the British people, acknowledging the scale of the operation and the immense challenge that lay ahead. Yet, his message was clear: victory was possible, and the liberation of Western Europe was within reach. His steadfast leadership and ability to inspire the British people were crucial in maintaining their resolve in the face of the uncertainties of war. As the invasion began on June 6, 1944, with the landings on Normandy's beaches, the fate of the war was being decided. The success of D-Day would lead to the eventual liberation of France, the defeat of Nazi Germany, and the collapse of the Axis powers. But for Churchill, it was also the moment that confirmed his long-held belief: only through determined action, unity, and unwavering commitment could the Allies overcome the darkest days of war and ensure a victory for freedom. The morning of June 6, 1944, marked a turning point in World War II. The largest amphibious invasion in history had begun. As Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, a new chapter in the war was written, one that would eventually lead to the liberation of Western Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany. For Winston Churchill, this was the culmination of years of planning, collaboration, and sacrifice. The success of Operation Overlord, the code name for the D-Day invasion, would depend on the precision and resolve of the Allies, and Churchill was determined to ensure the operation's success. Churchill had long advocated for a second front in Western Europe, and after years of strategic buildup and collaboration with President Roosevelt and General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the moment had finally arrived. D-Day was not only a critical military operation, but a symbol of the Allied unity and determination to push the Nazis out of Europe. For Churchill, the stakes could not have been higher. If the invasion succeeded, it would lead to the eventual liberation of France, open the door for a final assault on Nazi Germany, and help secure peace in Europe. But if the operation failed, it could delay the end of the war for years and prolong the suffering of the people under Nazi rule. The initial stages of the invasion were nothing short of audacious. At 6:30 on June 6th, the first wave of Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. The goal was to secure vital beachheads: Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold Beach, Juno Beach, and Sword Beach, and to create a foothold in northern France for which the Allies could launch further offensives. Over 156,000 Allied troops, including American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces, landed on those beaches, supported by a vast armada of ships, tanks, and aircraft. The invasion was a monumental effort in both scale and complexity. It involved not only the landing forces, but also airborne divisions that had been dropped behind enemy lines the night before, tasked with securing critical positions such as bridges and road junctions. Operation Overlord was a test of both military strategy and logistical coordination, and it was a success in large part due to the planning and leadership that Churchill had helped put in place. As the landings began, Churchill anxiously awaited news of the operation's progress. In London, he closely monitored the situation, staying in constant communication with General Eisenhower and his commanders. The fate of the invasion, and with it, the fate of Europe, was still uncertain. While the initial landings were successful, the fighting was fierce. Omaha Beach was the site of the heaviest resistance, where American forces faced intense German artillery and machine gun fire. The Allied forces suffered heavy casualties, but the beachhead was eventually secured after fierce fighting. For Churchill, the successful landings marked the beginning of a new phase in the war. However, it was also clear that the path to victory would be long and hard-fought. As the Allies began pushing inland, they faced continued German resistance. The Normandy campaign would last for several weeks, as the Allies worked to break through German defenses and establish a secure line of supply. The resistance was formidable, but Churchill, ever the optimist, remained confident in the ultimate success of the operation. In the days following D-Day, Churchill's leadership was instrumental in maintaining Allied unity and morale. He continued to emphasize the significance of the operation, declaring that it was the beginning of the end of the Nazi regime. The success of D-Day had given the Allies their first significant victory on the European mainland, and Churchill used this to galvanize support both at home and among the international community. He understood the importance of sustaining morale, not just among the military, but also among civilians who had been living with the constant threat of invasion for years. As the Allies advanced into France, the liberation of Paris became a symbol of the broader Allied victory. Churchill's focus, however, was on ensuring the rapid expansion of the Allied foothold in Europe and continuing the push to destroy the Nazi war machine. The invasion of Normandy was only the beginning. The Allied forces would need to continue their advance into France, Belgium, and eventually Germany. Churchill's leadership would continue to play a critical role as the war transitioned from defensive operations to the liberation of occupied territories. The success of D-Day and the subsequent campaigns in France were not only a testament to the strategic brilliance of the Allied leaders, but also to the strength and resolve of the soldiers, airmen, and sailors who fought to liberate Europe. Churchill's role in D-Day, both as a military strategist and as a rallying figure for the Allied cause, ensured that the operation achieved its objectives. The invasion set the stage for the eventual collapse of the Nazi regime and the end of the war in Europe. The success of D-Day on June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. As the Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy and established a foothold in France, the push into Western Europe gained momentum. For Winston Churchill, this was a pivotal moment in his leadership, as the next phase of the war required him to navigate both military strategy and political diplomacy to ensure the ultimate defeat of Hitler's regime. The period following D-Day saw intense fighting as Allied forces advanced eastward, liberating towns and cities across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. By August 1944, Paris was liberated, a monumental achievement that symbolized the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. For Churchill, the liberation of Paris was a significant moment. He had long believed that the Allied forces needed to move quickly to secure vital positions in Europe, ensuring that the Soviet Union, which had already been pushing the Germans back on the Eastern Front, would not reach Berlin first. The race to liberate Europe was now a cooperative effort between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, and Churchill was focused on maintaining Britain's influence in the post-war world order. In the midst of these military victories, Churchill's leadership faced new challenges. He understood that the war effort was not just about defeating the Axis powers, but about shaping the future of Europe after the war. As the Allies advanced further into Nazi-occupied territories, Churchill worked closely with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin to discuss the post-war restructuring of Europe. Churchill's primary concern was preserving the British Empire, which had been severely weakened by the war, but remained a significant global presence. As the war continued into 1945, Churchill's diplomatic efforts were critical in ensuring that Britain's interests would be safeguarded in the aftermath of the war. However, the Yalta Conference in February 1945, where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met to discuss the post-war world, revealed the growing tensions between the Allies. While the three leaders agreed on the importance of defeating Nazi Germany and ensuring long-lasting peace, disagreements began to surface, particularly over the fate of Eastern Europe. Stalin's desire to establish a sphere of Soviet influence in the region came into conflict with Churchill's aim to preserve democratic governments in countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Despite these differences, Churchill continued to play a critical role in shaping the direction of the war and the post-war peace process. He recognized that Britain, though weakened by the war, had a vital role to play in the new global order. His efforts to maintain Britain's influence were not without challenges, especially as the Soviet Union became more entrenched in Eastern Europe and the Cold War began to take shape. Churchill's determination to safeguard Britain's position on the world stage will become one of the defining features of his leadership in the years following the war. As the war neared its conclusion in 1945, Churchill's focus remained on securing victory in Western Europe and ensuring that Nazi Germany would be defeated. The Allied invasion of Italy in 1943, though important, had been a lengthy and challenging campaign, and the final assault on Germany would require the full strength of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. By April 1945, Berlin had been encircled by Soviet forces, and Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker. The final months of the war in Europe were marked by a rapid series of events. Germany's unconditional surrender was signed on May 7, 1945, bringing an end to the war in Europe. For Churchill, the victory was bittersweet. While he had led Britain through its darkest days and helped orchestrate the defeat of Nazi Germany, the cost had been immense, and the post-war world would be drastically different. Churchill knew that the outcome of the war would have The final months of the war in Europe were marked by a rapid series of events. Germany's unconditional surrender was signed on May 7, 1945, bringing an end to the war in Europe. For Churchill, the victory was bittersweet. While he had led Britain through its darkest days and helped orchestrate the defeat of Nazi Germany, the cost had been immense, and the post-war world would be drastically different. Churchill knew that the outcome of the war would have profound consequences not just for Britain, but for the entire world. In the days following Germany's surrender, Churchill worked alongside Roosevelt and Stalin to ensure that the post-war peace process would bring stability to Europe. However, the shifting dynamics of the Allied relationship, particularly with the Soviet Union, foreshadowed the emerging Cold War, which would define global politics for decades to come. Churchill's leadership during the war was instrumental in securing the defeat of Nazi Germany, but he also recognized that the coming years would present new challenges in maintaining peace and stability in a world fundamentally altered by the war. The end of World War II marked the conclusion of one of the most significant chapters in modern history, and Churchill's legacy as a wartime leader was firmly cemented. His courage, determination, and strategic vision had helped lead Britain through its darkest hour and into the light of victory. But as Europe began the long process of reconstruction, Churchill's role in shaping the post-war world would continue to evolve as he navigated the complexities of a new geopolitical landscape. As World War II neared its conclusion, the leadership of Winston Churchill had been a driving force in the Allied victory. From the darkest days of the Blitz to the daring D-Day landings, Churchill's resolve and determination had been the cornerstone of Britain's resistance against Nazi Germany. By May 1945, after years of grueling warfare, the Allied forces had achieved victory in Europe. Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7, 1945, marked the end of the war in Europe, but for Churchill, this victory also marked the beginning of a new set of challenges. In the final months of the war, Churchill's focus had been not just on the defeat of Nazi Germany, but on ensuring that Britain's position in the post-war world would remain strong. The devastation wrought by the war had left Europe in ruins, and Churchill recognized that the shape of the future would depend on how the Allied powers negotiated peace and handled the reconstruction of Europe. His commitment to securing a new world order, rooted in peace, democracy, and the preservation of Britain's global influence, was as vital as his wartime leadership. However, with victory came the dawning realization that Britain's empire was in decline. The war had drained Britain's resources, and the economic devastation of the conflict made it clear that the world had changed. Churchill was faced with the difficult task of guiding Britain through the aftermath of war, while also securing a place for the country in the evolving geopolitical landscape. He was also deeply concerned about the growing influence of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, which was becoming increasingly authoritarian under Joseph Stalin. Churchill's role at the Yalta Conference in February 1945 had laid the groundwork for the post-war peace process, but tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union were beginning to surface. Churchill's commitment to democratic ideals in Eastern Europe came into direct conflict with Stalin's desire to establish a Soviet sphere of influence. Churchill, ever the realist, knew that Britain could not confront the Soviet Union militarily, but pushed for the establishment of democratic governments in countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. However, Stalin's dominance over Eastern Europe was becoming increasingly evident, signaling the onset of what would become the Cold War. Despite these challenges, Churchill remained committed to the future peace of Europe. He championed the creation of a United Nations, an international body aimed at preventing future conflicts and promoting global cooperation. His vision for a post-war Europe included not just security, but the rebuilding of nations and economies, and he believed that strong international alliances would be essential for a lasting peace. Churchill's leadership and legacy, however, were also influenced by domestic concerns. While he had led Britain through its darkest days, by July 1945, the war was over, and it was clear that Britain was facing a new set of challenges. The Labour Party, which had grown in strength during the war, won a sweeping victory in the general elections. Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, succeeded Churchill as Prime Minister, marking the end of Churchill's tenure. The British public, weary from the war, was ready for change, and Attlee's government would embark on ambitious social reforms, including the establishment of the National Health Service and nationalization of key industries. Churchill, despite his monumental wartime leadership, was voted out of office in 1945, a reflection of the changing political climate. While many admired his role in leading Britain through the war, the public's focus had shifted to post-war reconstruction and the promise of a better future. Nevertheless, Churchill's contribution to the victory in World War II was undeniable, and his leadership during the war would become a central part of his legacy. In the years following the war, Churchill would continue to play a prominent role in global affairs. He returned to power as Prime Minister in 1951, but by then, the landscape had changed dramatically. The world was entering the Cold War era, with the United States and the Soviet Union emerging as the two dominant superpowers. Churchill's vision for the future was rooted in the belief that Britain's place in the world had to be safeguarded, even as the British Empire was beginning to unravel. His determination to preserve peace and stability in the post-war world remained central to his political thinking. Churchill's legacy, however, would not be defined by his post-war leadership alone. He would always be remembered as the man who had stood at the helm of Britain during its darkest hour, a man whose resolve and determination helped secure the defeat of Nazi Germany. His speeches, his tireless campaigning, and his leadership during the Battle of Britain, D-Day, and the final push into Europe would remain an indelible part of the British psyche. Ultimately, Churchill's legacy was as a wartime leader who inspired a nation to fight against tyranny, a statesman who played a key role in shaping the post-war world, and a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. His contributions to both the war effort and the peace that followed would ensure that his place in history was secured. Despite the challenges that lay ahead, Churchill had helped lead Britain to victory, and his legacy as the conclusion of World War II marked the end of an era for Winston Churchill and for Britain itself. Having led the nation through its darkest hours, Churchill's wartime legacy was secure, but the challenges that awaited him in the post-war years were vastly different from those of the war years. The British public, exhausted by 6 years of conflict, was now focused on rebuilding the country and addressing the deep social and economic issues that had been exacerbated by the war. Despite his towering reputation as a wartime leader, Churchill faced significant political obstacles when the Labour Party came to power in the aftermath of the war. The general election of July 1945 was a defining moment in British politics, and it saw the Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, win a sweeping victory. The British public, eager for change, gave Attlee a mandate to implement sweeping social reforms, including the establishment of the National Health Service, NHS, the nationalization of key industries, and the expansion of the welfare state. This post-war social revolution stood in stark contrast to Churchill's more conservative and imperialist views. The loss of the 1945 election was a bitter blow for Churchill. Though he had been widely admired for his leadership during the war, the realities of post-war Britain, including economic austerity and the desire for social reform, meant that his party's message of a return to traditional values and empire was not what the country needed at that moment. Churchill was now in opposition, and though he continued to be an influential voice in British politics, he faced a government that was determined to transform Britain into a modern welfare state. For Churchill, this period in opposition was challenging, but it did not mark the end of his political career. He remained a dominant figure in British politics, and his reputation as a great leader during the war ensured that his voice carried weight. However, he also recognized the changing political landscape. He had come to terms with the fact that the British Empire was in decline, and the world was moving away from colonialism toward a new era of international cooperation and self-determination for former colonies. Churchill's vision of Britain's place in the world had to evolve as the global order shifted. The 1945 election loss was not the final chapter of Churchill's political career. In 1951, after 6 years in opposition, Churchill made a remarkable return to power. The Labour government, despite its domestic successes, was struggling with economic difficulties, and there was growing discontent with its handling of foreign policy, especially regarding the emerging Cold War tensions. The Conservative Party, under Churchill's leadership, campaigned on the promise of stability and experience in a rapidly changing world. Churchill's second term as Prime Minister, beginning in 1951, was marked by his continued influence in international affairs, particularly with regard to the Cold War. Though his health was deteriorating, and he was no longer the energetic or dynamic leader he had been during the war, Churchill remained a formidable figure in global politics. He was deeply concerned with the rise of the Soviet Union and the spread of communism, and he worked closely with President Dwight D. Eisenhower to ensure that the Western powers stood united in the face of Soviet aggression. Churchill's role in NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and his support for European integration were central to his post-war legacy. Despite his return to power, Churchill's second term as Prime Minister was not without challenges. His health was a constant concern, and there were times when his ability to lead effectively was questioned. The pressures of leading Britain through the early stages of the Cold War, dealing with the economic realities of post-war Britain, and managing the decline of the British Empire took a toll on him. However, his leadership during this period was still highly regarded, and his experience, wisdom, and stature continued to serve Britain on the world stage. Churchill's political comeback in 1951 was a testament to his enduring legacy. Though his time as Prime Minister during the 1950s was shorter than his wartime leadership, it solidified his status as one of the greatest statesmen in British history. His influence in global affairs and his dedication to preserving Britain's role in the post-war world would leave an indelible mark on both British and world politics. In the years following World War II, Winston Churchill's leadership took on a new dimension as he sought to navigate the complexities of the post-war world. Despite the challenges of his second term as Prime Minister, which were compounded by his declining health and Britain's economic struggles, Churchill remained a crucial figure on the world stage, particularly in the emerging Cold War. His influence on global affairs was not only felt in Europe but across the Atlantic, where his strong relationship with the United States would help shape the direction of the post-war order. Churchill's central concern in the aftermath of the war was the spread of Soviet communism and the need to contain its influence in Europe. As the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, Churchill became increasingly vocal about the dangers of a divided Europe. His famous Iron Curtain speech, delivered in Fulton, Missouri, in March 1946, captured the essence of his fears. In this address, Churchill warned of the Soviet Union's expansionist policies and the division of Europe into communist and capitalist spheres. He declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, separating the Soviet-controlled East from the free West. This speech marked the beginning of Churchill's vision for a united Western Europe, where democratic nations could work together to resist Soviet influence. His warning of the Soviet threat was prophetic, as tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated into what would become the Cold War. Though Churchill was no longer Prime Minister when he delivered the speech, his message resonated strongly with both American and British leaders, who recognized the urgency of containing communism. Churchill's relationship with President Harry S. Truman and his efforts to strengthen the Anglo-American alliance were central to his post-war foreign policy. While Roosevelt had been his close partner during the war, Truman, who took office after Roosevelt's death in 1945, was somewhat more cautious. Despite these differences, Churchill worked diligently to ensure that the United States remained committed to a strong partnership with Britain in the face of the Soviet threat. The Truman Doctrine and the subsequent Marshall Plan, which provided U.S. economic aid to Western European nations, were vital to preventing the spread of communism, and Churchill fully supported these initiatives. One of the most significant post-war decisions that Churchill supported was the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949. NATO was designed as a military alliance between Western powers to counter the Soviet threat in Europe. Churchill had long believed in the importance of maintaining strong alliances with the United States and other Western democracies. His support for NATO was a testament to his continued belief in the necessity of collective security in the face of global threats. Churchill also had a vision for the future of Europe. He understood that the only way to prevent the continent from descending into further conflict was through economic and political cooperation. As early as 1946, he had called for the creation of a United States of Europe ***. While he did not advocate for full integration at the time, Churchill believed that a united Europe, linked by strong economic and political ties, would be essential for preserving peace and preventing the rise of totalitarian regimes. However, despite his advocacy for European unity, Churchill's approach to European integration was tempered by his commitment to Britain's sovereignty and the preservation of the British Empire. He was not fully supportive of European institutions such as the European Economic Community, EEC, which he saw as potentially undermining Britain's autonomy. Churchill's reluctance to fully embrace European integration became more apparent as the European Coal and Steel Community and other efforts toward economic unity began to take shape in the 1950s. In addition to his role in shaping the political landscape of Europe and his efforts to curb the influence of communism, Churchill's leadership during this period was also defined by his handling of the British Empire. The war had significantly weakened the empire, and decolonization was increasingly seen as inevitable. Churchill, despite his deep attachment to the empire, recognized that Britain could no longer maintain control over its far-flung colonies. His post-war leadership involved negotiating the independence of India in 1947, although he remained reluctant to see the empire crumble. The post-war period was also marked by the growing realization that Britain's global power was in decline. The financial strain of the war, coupled with the changing political and economic dynamics, meant that Britain could no longer afford the vast military and colonial commitments it had previously enjoyed. Despite this, Churchill's leadership in navigating Britain's place in the New World Order was instrumental in maintaining Britain's influence on the global stage, especially as a key player in the United Nations and NATO. By 1953, Churchill's second term as Prime Minister was drawing to a close. Though he had contributed significantly to the shaping of post-war Europe and had been central in managing Britain's role in the Cold War, the challenges of governing a post-war Britain were immense. The pressure of managing an economy that was still recovering from a war, coupled with the demands of global diplomacy, took a toll on Churchill's health. He resigned as Prime Minister in 1955, but remained active in British politics and international affairs as a revered figure in both the UK and abroad. In the later years of his life, Winston Churchill faced the reality of declining health while continuing to wield considerable influence in both British politics and on the global stage. After stepping down as Prime Minister in 1955, Churchill entered a new phase of his life, marked by a combination of political activity and personal challenges. Despite his physical frailty, his mind remained sharp, and his influence continued to resonate far beyond the halls of Westminster. Churchill's second term as Prime Minister had been a difficult one, with his health deteriorating due to his age and the immense stress of leadership. After leading Britain through the rigors of World War II, his body, though still strong in spirit, began to show the wear and tear of decades of relentless service. Churchill had been a man accustomed to working long hours, rarely resting, and engaging in continuous diplomatic and military strategy. Now, in his later years, he found himself grappling with the physical limitations that often come with aging. Strokes and illnesses would increasingly impair his ability to govern as he had before, leading to his decision to retire from the office of Prime Minister in 1955. Though Churchill was no longer at the helm of government, his legacy continued to loom large. Anthony Eden, his successor, took over leadership of the Conservative Party, but Churchill remained an important figure in British politics. While no longer in power, he was still consulted by his colleagues, especially on matters of foreign policy, and his voice carried significant weight in debates surrounding Britain's role in the world. He remained active in writing, delivering speeches, and offering his guidance to political leaders at home and abroad. However, his age and health issues meant that he was increasingly confined to the background, where his influence, though significant, was more symbolic. One of Churchill's key contributions in these years was his role in the Cold War. While not in government, He continued to speak out about the growing threat of Soviet expansion and the need for Western unity against communism. His efforts to strengthen the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, his advocacy for European integration, and his warnings about the dangers of appeasement remained important aspects of his post-war diplomacy. Churchill had always viewed the Soviet Union as a serious threat to Western civilization, and his warnings, particularly after the war, continued to shape Western foreign policy. Churchill's legacy was not confined to military and political matters alone. His influence extended to cultural, social, and historical realms. As the years went on, Churchill was increasingly seen as a symbol of national strength, resilience, and determination. His speeches and writings were widely read, and his leadership during World War II was frequently referenced as a model of how to confront adversity. Despite the difficulties of his later years, Churchill's place in history was secure. He had been a central figure in not only the defeat of Nazi Germany, but also in the establishment of a post-war world order that would preserve democratic values, free markets, and international cooperation. In the latter part of his life, Churchill's health declined significantly. Having survived several strokes, he became more frail, and his ability to participate in politics diminished. Yet, Churchill continued to write, work, and contribute to public life. In the 1950s and early 1960s, he was often seen as a living legend, someone whose past achievements continued to influence both the British public and the world. His continued involvement in political and historical discussions ensured that he remained a relevant figure, even as his health failed him. He was made an honorary citizen of the United States in 1963, a testament to his international reputation and the esteem in which he was held. Churchill's final years were also marked by reflections on his legacy. He was keenly aware of his place in history and worked to ensure that his contributions to the war effort and to Britain's global role were remembered. His memoirs and his reflections on both the First and Second World Wars provided a final, personal account of his leadership, his vision, and his understanding of the broader forces at play during the 20th century. Churchill passed away on January 24, 1965, at the age of 90. His death marked the end of an era for both Britain and the world. For the British people, Churchill had been more than just a leader. He had been a symbol of hope, determination, and resilience. His wartime leadership had saved Britain from the clutches of tyranny, and his post-war diplomacy had helped shape the modern world order. Though Churchill had faced personal and political setbacks in his later years, his legacy as a wartime leader, a statesman, and a visionary endures. His impact on Britain and the world is immeasurable. He was not just a leader in times of war, but also a champion of democracy, liberty, and the rule of law, principles that would continue to shape the post-war world for generations. Churchill's legacy is firmly entrenched in the collective memory of the British people and in the history of the 20th century. His leadership, his words, and his vision continue to inspire and guide leaders around the world. He remains one of the most iconic figures of modern history, embodying the ideals of courage, determination, and the unwavering fight for freedom.